Get out of my way, stupid Deku. Katsuki Bakugo shouted, shoving the younger, shorter, green-haired kid in front of him onto the floor. Kakin, Deku, or rather Izuku Midoriya, cried out, his eyes watering as he looked up at the spiky blonde-haired, red-eyed boy above him. The two of them had been friends of sorts once. Or rather, Izuku had been a member of Katsuki's entourage, following him around with the rest of his hanger-ons, watching in awe as Katsuki's showed off his powerful, flashy quirk every chance he got. And it was a pretty cool quirk too. Katsuki's sweat was explosive or something, and he could ignite it at will. It was a flashy quirk, and already the teachers at the local school they went to had earmarked him for greatness. Perhaps even more impressive than his quirk, though, was the fact that the blonde had only discovered what his quirk was the other year, a few weeks after he turned 4. But despite that, he was already showing a startling amount of control over it. A genius. That is what the teachers and many of the students at school had started calling him, and understandably considering his age, it had started to go to his head. Stop sniveling, you useless Deku. The 5-year-old Katsuki Bakugo snapped, kicking at green-haired kid at his feet, even as the rest of their group, all of whom had already discovered their own quirks, dutifully laughed along. Stop it, Kakin! Izuku cried out, struggling to his feet, even as his childish face twisted into an expression of pain, embarrassment, and juvenile anger. Izuku was the only member of their group who had not discovered their quirk yet, and already the others had started bullying him because of this. Even the kid who had only discovered his quirk, which allowed him to extend his fingers, just the other month. No, you stop following me, Deku. If you've not got a quirk, then you're not my friend, Katsuki replied, his own face contorting into a look of childish fury, even as he raised his right hand and pointed it at Izuku, small sparks erupting off of his palm threateningly as he did so. Kakin! Izuku cried out, tears beginning to fall from his eyes now, as his best friend, the kid he had known pretty much from birth, glared hatefully down at him. Go away, Deku, and stop following me. Katsuki spat back, shoving Izuku over again and sending him falling onto his bum. From beside Katsuki, another one of Izuku's friends got in on the action and kicked some dirt at him, his slightly chubby face twisting up into a mean smile as he and several of the others all started guffawing and laughing at Izuku, even as he rubbed the dirt out of his teary eyes. Come on, let's go, Katsuki called out, looking away from his useless former friend as he did so, before he started walking back to the playground, his troop of fellow 5-year-old friends following along after him, all of them laughing and playing around with their multitude of quirks, and none of them bothering to look back. Sniveling as he watched his friends walk away, Izuku pushed himself off of the ground and ran away. His white shirt and green shorts were all dirty now, his nose was snotty, his eyes were red, and his cheeks were stained with tears. He was a mess, and he knew it. More than that, though, he knew that if he tried to join in with Kakin and the others, that they would all mock him and bully more than ever if they saw him looking this pathetic. Running through the gates of the park, Izuku kept his head down as he ran towards the apartment building his little family lived in, ignoring the stares and odd looks he received from those he passed as he ran up the stairs and towards his top-floor apartment. Later that evening, I really wish you would tell me what happened to get you so upset, honey. Inko Midoriya, a tall, slim, dark, green-haired woman, and Izuku's mother, said softly as she carefully cleaned the bloody scrape on her son's knee. It's nothing, Izuku replied churlishly, looking away from his mother's caring gaze and over to where his father was sat reading a paper as he did so. Don't keep it all bottled up, honey. It's not healthy. Inko pushed, putting down the wet cloth she had been using to clean the cut as she instead went to grab a plaster out of her first aid box. I said it's nothing. Izuku snapped, his voice as sharp as a 5-year-old child's could be, which was apparently still enough to take his caring, loving mother aback, especially since Izuku was normally such a sweet and kind little boy. Izuku, Inko cried out, not hurt or offended by his words, but rather worried about what could have happened to get her son acting like this. Hisashi Midoriya, Izuku's father, however, was another story. The man had always been a short-tempered man. However, the years of mockery he had received due to his weak quirk and the less than stellar life he had ended up having after bombing out of one of the regional hero academies in his youth had all made him into an even harder, bitterer man. The fact that his son, Izuku, was probably quirkless had only made him meaner and more aggressive. Kids usually showed whether they had a quirk or not before they were 5. Izuku was over 5 now, and already Inko had suggested taking him to a doctor's to see if there was something wrong. "Don't talk to your mother like that," Hisashi snapped, slamming his paper down on the table in anger, small wisps of smoke trailing out of his mouth as he glared at his son, his cold, dark eyes making the boy flinch, even as an intimidating red glow seemed to form in the back of his throat as he started using his fire-breathing quirk. Sorry, D-Dad," Izuku muttered, looking down straight away, his heart thundering in his little chest as he saw his father's intimidating display and saw the flash of anger in his eyes. His father was not usually a violent, or at least not to Izuku, but he would shout and yell a lot, and occasionally, when he was really angry, lash out at his wife, Inko, in anger. "Hisashi, stop it. You're scaring him." Inko shot back, her usually kind face furrowing into a frown as she stood up and scowled at her husband. "And you're mollycoddling him too much," Hisashi snapped, standing up now, his temper getting even worse when he saw his less than dutiful and obedient wife not only standing up to him, but also talking back. "He's our son, and he's 5. Of course I am going to look after him." Inko snapped, pushing the scared-looking Izuku behind her now, even as her husband began to advance on her, the glow emanating from his mouth getting all the more intense with every step. "He's your son, he's not mine. As if I would ever father a quirkless freak like that." Hisashi snapped, his anger getting the best of him now as the situation quickly started to escalate. Hearing his father's words, Izuku looked down at the floor in shame, tears beginning to fall and his whole body beginning to shake. Inko, though, had a different reaction. With a flash of anger, she slapped her husband across the face, her protective, motherly fury overtaking the fear that usually filled her when her husband got worked up like this. "How dare you?" she snapped, her hands stinging even as she knocked her husband's head to the side, a burst of fire spewing out of his mouth and striking some nearby curtains, setting them ablaze. Ignoring the fire, though, Hisashi's eyes instead flashed with rage as he turned back and struck his wife, his hands sounding out loud as he hit her across the face as hard as he could and sent her falling backwards, only for her head to hit a nearby coffee table with a dull crack. "Mom!" Izuku cried out in horror, running to his mother's side in shock and fear, not noticing as he did so that the cut on his knee had rapidly started to heal. "Aw shit," Hisashi cursed, not paying attention to his motionless wife as he instead looked at the burning curtain, a scowl on his face as he quickly and efficiently pulled them down off of the rail and started stamping on them, quickly trying to put them out. Izuku, though, didn't pay attention to his father's obscenities. Instead, he continued to cry and tearfully shake his mother's still form, his tear-filled eyes soon noticing the blood pooling around her head and staining the carpet, even as his childish mind also clocked on to how she wasn't moving anymore or breathing. "Will you make yourself useful for once in your damned life and get some water from the kitchen?" Hisashi snapped, even as he continued to stamp on the still smoldering curtains, his dark eyes snapping over to his son and motionless wife as he did so, only for the elder Midoriya to freeze as his eyes locked onto his son. Izuku's face was twisted into an expression of rage and fury, a look that was so alien to his cowardly son's face that just the sight of it made his heart skip a beat. Izuku," Hisashi said in shock, a shiver of fear traveling down his spine as he saw his son's head snap around to look at him. Izuku's green eyes were practically glowing, and steam was now visibly starting to flow off of his body, the heat now coming off of him causing the air around him to ripple, even as the boy's face continued to contort into an inhuman mask of absolute fury. Hisashi began, swallowing back his nerves as those glowing green eyes bored into him, only for him to be interrupted before he could say any by his son letting loose a roar of fury, after which his world went dark as the air around him exploded with heat, and he found himself crushed to death against the wall of his apartment, his ribcage shattering, his skull cracking, and his organs all being pulverized in a single instant. Outside of the apartment. Outside of the apartment, all of those present, either in the streets or in their own homes, instantly heard the deafening scream of fury, even as the eyes of those on the streets shot towards the source of the sound. As they did so, however, fresh screams and cries of horror began to sound out from the streets as those below caught sight of the colossal, 20-meter-tall giant that stood steaming on the top floor of the apartment building, rubble and scraps of stone raining down all around it. Even as the titan spread his massive, human-like arms wide and let loose another inhuman bellow of rage. The greenish-black hair that covered its massive head shifting slightly to the side as it leant its head back, its giant maw opening as it released its cry of rage to the world at large, revealing as it did so a set of glowing, phosphorus green eyes. Moments later, the apartment building the creatures was standing on collapsed, the giant monster's weight proving far too much for the structure below it. Even as it crashed through the 4 apartments below it, the building around it exploding outwards as it did so. As this happened, the people on the street, and those within their homes, turned and ran. Those on the streets sprinting as far away from this monstrous villain, for what else could it be, as possible. The calmer amongst them calling for the police or for a pro-hero as they ran, alerting all and sundry to the presence of the villain as fast as they could so that they could get the help they needed. Even so, despite the quick response, some were not able to run far enough, as with another roar of rage the gigantic titan tore through the remnants of the apartment building around it and started to rampage through the city district, crashing through any buildings that got in its way and crushing people and cars underfoot as it lashed out in bestial fury at anything that got in its way. As the creature went on its rampage, screams and shouts of terror and fear soon filled the streets, mixing in with the sounds of buildings being destroyed, sirens sounding out in the distance, and the creature's own deafening roars and screams of fury. By the time the sun rose the next day, and the pro-heroes, led by All Might himself, finally managed to put the monster down, 364 people had lost their lives, including 3 pro-heroes. Hundreds more, both civilians and heroes, both had been injured, and thousands were left homeless. The events of that night, known to many as the Night of Great Loss, quickly went down in the history books and became infamous, both because of the sheer amount of damage and death that had been caused before the heroes could stop the titanic creature, and because the culprit turned out to be a 5-year-old child, Izuku Midoriya. 10 years later, there was a calm expression on the small, mouse-like being's face as he walked through the clean, clinical-looking, white halls of Asphodel, a facility that had been specifically created for the containment, punishment, and rehabilitation of under 16-year-old Quirk users. This place was commonly referred to as the younger brother of the maximum security jail, Tartarus, a bigger and far more secure and secret facility, within which the most powerful and terrible villains in society were kept. That said, not all of those who were contained within the Asphodel were juvenile criminals or villains. After all, although there were many in the facility who did fit this description, with some of those that were being kept in Asphodel were only being kept there until they turned 17 and were eligible to be sent to Tartarus. That did not mean all of the 215 inmates were criminals. No, not all fit within that category. After all, there were some inmates in the highly secure facility who were being only kept here for their own good. These children were criminals. Instead, they were the victims of their own quirks. Any of these young people had been born blessed or cursed, depending on your interpretation, with having an exceptionally powerful and yet completely uncontrollable quirk, so much so that they were a danger to themselves or to others. In a world where everyone had superpowers, most of which tended to manifest in early childhood, incidents did occasionally occur where a child, through no fault of their own, awoke their quirk or lost control of their quirk, and because of this hurt or killed people or destroyed the area around them. These events didn't happen often, but they did happen. For example, one of the children kept in Asphodel, an 8-year-old girl that had only been brought into the facility early this year, had lost control of her suspected wind-controlling quirk while she was in class at school. The teacher and 25 children had all suffocated to death when the girl had accidentally sucked all the oxygen out of the air around her. When these events did happen, the government often tried to hush them up or manipulate the facts in the media, whilst the child in question was taken off to a facility like Asphodel where they could be taught control and restraint, and where, if all else fails, they could be permanently contained. These children, 16 and under, were all kept in the deepest level of Asphodel, in the most secure part of the facility, where they were educated and taught control, all while being constantly watched and monitored. Currently, there were 16 such cases in the Asphodel, and one of those cases was who Nizu was here to see. Continuing down the hallway, Nizu, the principal of UA High, one of the country's premier hero academies, and his companion, a tall, skeletal man with long, lank blonde hair and tired-looking blue eyes, soon came to a stop in front of a set of large metal doors. "Hello," Nizu called out, in his soft and high-pitched voice. The small, mouse-like being, a literal animal that had had the luck to be born with an intelligence quirk, reaching out and knocking on the metal door as he did so. Principal Nizu, they do know you're coming, right?" The blonde man, Toshinori Yagi, asked softly as he looked down at the diminutive headmaster, his voice coming out a little hoarse as if he were trying to hold back a cough. Yes, they sent the invite, and I agreed to come." Nizu nodded, his voice still pleasant as the little mouse-like being took a step back, smoothing down his smart, noticeably scaled down, suit as he did so, after which he then waved at a camera overhead. "Hello, I am here." The blonde man, Toshinori, sent Nizu a wry sideways glance as he did this. A few moments later, though, before either of them could say another word, the metal doors opened with a dull hiss, even as a tall, thin, rangy-looking man stepped out. The man in question looking to be in his 60s and wearing a dark suit and tie, over the top of which he wore a clean, white lab coat. "Principal Nizu, I presume?" The older man spoke, his voice dry, yet kindly as he smiled down at the principal, his smile widening slightly when Nizu nodded. Good. Sorry about the wait. They did buzz down from above and tell me you had arrived and were heading down here, but I'm afraid I thought I had more time before you would arrive. You see, we don't really get very many visitors down here on the lowest floor, I am afraid." "Oh, it's fine, Dr. Nakamura, no problem at all," Nizu replied with a nod and a smile, reading the man's name off of his lanyard. "Yes, fine." Toshinori nodded, the blonde man adjusting his yellow suit awkwardly as he noticed the doctor looking at him now. "I'm Toshinori Yagi. I'm also from UA." "Pleasure." Nakamura nodded with a smile, before he gestured for the two of them to follow him. "Well, come in. I know that he's quite excited to meet you, Principal Nizu." With that said, the three men entered the corridor behind the metal doors, even as they hissed closed behind them. Neither of the three looking back as they instead continued down the long, white corridor, the three of them occasionally passing by a large blanked-out window and an electronic door as they walked. Looking over at one of the doors they passed, Toshinori noticed that the door in question had the words Cell 6 on it. The doors they were passing were each containment cells, and the windows, they were electronic one-way windows through which, when turned on, the occupants of the cell could be monitored directly. "So I have to say I am surprised you agreed to come, Principal Nizu. I'll be honest, when he first made his plans known, I did have some doubts as to whether any hero academies would accept him, let alone the most prestigious one of all, UA." Nakamura suddenly said, making polite conversation as they continued down the hall, the three of them occasionally passing an armed guard as they did so. "Yes, well, I will admit, I was a bit leery at first, but his application to the school was good, his educational results were stellar, and the power he possesses is unquestionable. Most of all, though, I was impressed by his commitment to being a hero and his desire to make amends for his past deeds, even when those deeds were not entirely his fault." Nizu replied cheerfully, not revealing as he did so just how leery he truly was about allowing the applicant in question to try out for UA. Already he had had to argue the case with the school's board of governors, its many sponsors and alumni, and with the government in general, all of whom, although not directly opposed to the boy, were still nervous and wary about letting such an individual into the school, both due to the danger he posed because of the potential reputational damage the school might suffer if something went wrong. Still, all parties had eventually agreed that the boy be allowed to at least try out. After all, he fit all the requirements, and his situation was not truly unique. Already there had been other recruits from Asphodel to attend UA, those that had not been able to control their quirk when they were younger, but who, despite this, had still managed to graduate from UA and become pro-heroes. The number 2 hero, Endeavor, was just one example, as 2 was the UA teacher and rescue hero, 13. I'm glad. Nakamura nodded, coming to a stop for a moment as he did so before he looked to the 2 men. He's a good lad. A bit unyielding at times and very committed to his goals, but a decent, strong-heart kid all the same. Sure, he had a rough start to life, but without a doubt he has the heart and soul of a hero and the potential to be the best there ever was. You sound like you're quite attached to him, Toshinori muttered, cocking an eyebrow at the doctor as he did so. My relationship with him is strictly professional, but I can't deny that I'm not at least a little bit fond of him. He's been under my care for 10 years now. It's difficult to not grow a little attached after that amount of time. Nakamura shrugged, continuing to walk as he did so. And during those 10 years, he's gained complete control of his quirk. Needs a question. As I already made clear in my letter of recommendation, yes, Nakamura replied dryly, his lip quirking upwards in amusement at the question. He gained complete control of his quirk 5 years ago, and has spent the last 5 years honing his control and developing it. It wouldn't be a lie to say that he probably has more control over his quirk than most of the other kids his age have, even those who are also going to take the test next month. With that said, Nakamura came to a stop in front of the window to cell 2 and activated the window using a panel that was just next to the door, revealing the interior of the cell as he did so. Izuku Midoriya, Nakamura said, a slight smile on his face as the teen in question became visible along with his room, both Nizu and Toshinori standing beside him and leaning forward in interest as they and the doctor looked in at the prospective UA student inside. The room in question was quite Spartan. There was a neatly made bed in one corner of the room and a small bookcase in the other, 2 rows of what looked like journals or handwritten notebooks noticeably filling the shelves. Next to the bookcase, there was also chair and desk, on top of which a computer sat, with there being a UA-themed calendar pinned to the wall above the computer. On the other side of the room was the occupant, Izuku Midoriya. The 15-year-old had short, cropped, blackish-green hair, pale skin, and startlingly green eyes. He was also presently shirtless, and wearing nothing but a pair of sports shorts as he danced backwards and forwards, hitting the only other thing in the room, a large, swinging punching bag that hung just in front of the window that the 3 men were looking through. From where he was stood, Toshinori had to admit the boy's boxing form was all but perfect, his every blow swift, but striking with brutal strength and startling accuracy as he repeatedly struck the reinforced pad in front of him. Just from looking at the teen, it was obvious that he was very fit. Midoriya had a noticeably very muscled and heavily built frame, which even from where they were stood, could be seen to be glistening with a thin film of sweat as he landed blow after blow on the bag, without pause. His quirk, which we're calling Titan, allows him to grow to over 50 feet tall and gives him super strength, rapid cellular regeneration, and an odd ability to harden different parts of his body at will. As far as we can tell, he can make upwards of 10% of his body diamond hard at will. So far, we've also tested his strength and found that, when he takes his Titan form, he can deadlift 50 tons. In his normal human form, though, when we tested him, we found that he could only lift 5 tons. Similarly, when he is in his Titan form, he can regrow an entire hand in 5 seconds. In his human form, after extensive preparation and with his consent, we found that it took him nearly 50 seconds to regenerate his hand. Nakamura rattled off, choosing his words carefully as he did so. You experimented on him? Nizu asked sharply, his beady black eyes gleaming with a sudden ferocity as he looked up at the doctor. Not at all. After he gained control of his Titan form, we gave him opportunities to push the limits of his quirk, and he took them. All of the testing was done in a controlled way and was heavily supervised, and all done at his own insistence. Nakamura replied just as sharply. Nizu narrowed his eyes at that, but eventually nodded and looked back to the boy, allowing the doctor to continue his explanation. We also found that his ability to harden his body was affected too. When in his Titan form, he could make his fists as hard as diamonds. In his human form, however, they were only as hard as steel. From what we have managed to work out, in his base, human form, his abilities are a tenth as strong as they are when he is in his Titan form. Nakamura continued, his eyes gleaming with fascination as he watched Izuku's fist suddenly go a silvery blue color, even as he lashed out with a rapid combination of punches, battering the reinforced punching bag this way and that. That's still incredible. It's almost like he has 3 quirks in one, Toshinori muttered, glancing sideways at Nizu as he did so. Almost, Nizu muttered, watching Izuku carefully as he continued to punch the pad, apparently oblivious to the 3 people watching him through the one-way window as he continued training and refining his abilities. Yes, he is a bit of a special case. Nakamura nodded, a smirk on his face as he too watched Izuku train. Where a child usually develops one or other of his parents' quirks, or both if they are lucky, or some new evolved quirk which combines the two. Izuku's quirk is a brand new one. His mother had a minor telekinetic quirk, and his father could breathe fire. Izuku, though, his quirk is something completely different, a brand new mutation, a miraculous anomaly. It is incredibly rare, but is it not exactly unheard of for a child to develop a quirk completely unrelated to their parents' quirks, you know? Toshinori replied, a slight frown on his face as he went back to watch Midoriya, his brow furrowing and his shining with suspicion and caution as he watched the boy train. True, Nakamura allowed, before he grinned even wider. But Izuku is different. He is unique. Nizu muttered, sending the doctor a sideways look as he did so. Yes, when he takes the entrance exam to UA, he is going to show the world just how special he is. Nakamura nodded enthusiastically. And you're fine with him leaving your facility, never to return? Nizu asked curiously. He was eligible for release 5 years ago when he proved to the parole board that he could control his quirk. Nakamura shot back. But he chose to remain here at the time, honing his quirk and preparing for UA. You ask if I'm fine letting him go. Well, it's not up to me. It's up to him. Sure, I will miss him, but if he thinks that it is time for him to leave the nest and spread his wings, then that is that. Nizu nodded at that, a slight smile on his face as he looked back at the boy, even as he continued to dedicatedly punch his punching bag. The kid had a huge amount of potential. Truly, he'll be the next All Might. Nakamura muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a proud smile at the thought of his kid, the kid he had practically raised, becoming the next #1 hero. Toshinori, however, frowned worriedly as he saw the intense expression on Midoriya's face, his mind flashing back to 10 years ago and the fury and destruction that this very same boy had reaped back then. Even now he could hear his screams of the dying, the burning heat that radiated off of Midoriya in his Titan form, and the boy's bellow of fury. Was it truly a good idea to let the Titan, a walking catastrophe, come to UA? 10 years ago. Mum, get off me, he shouted, writhing in the older woman's grasp as she tried in vain to use the damp cloth in her hand to wipe the muck and dirt off of his face. Just hold still, his mother replied, her tone filled with amused irritation as she finally managed to pin her misbehaving offspring down. If you hadn't gone out and gotten so dirty and messy, then we wouldn't be having this problem in the first place. I mean, just what did you do? Fall in a river or something? Come on, Mum, stop it, he replied, trying to fight off her motherly attentions, even as he deliberately didn't admit to her that that was exactly what he had done. It wasn't like it was his fault that the log he was walking on was slippery, or that he had fallen off of it when he was crossing the river. Oh, just stop being a pain. His mother shot back, her attitude just as fierce as his own. It was why they clashed and argued so much. The two of them were just too similar. He opened his mouth to retort, however, before he could, a loud bellow of fury tore through the otherwise calm evening. Just the sound of it made his heart skip a beat, even as his mum released him in surprise, her red eyes shifting to the window, just in time to hear another loud, deafening roar, followed by the sound of people screaming and the sound of buildings collapsing. Mum, what's going on? He asked shakily, his heart thundering in his narrow chest, and his eyes starting to water as he felt, for the first time in his life, true, unrelenting terror. Cat Dash, his mother replied, turning to face him, the scowl no longer on her face, with it instead being replaced by fear. But not fear for herself. No, fear for her loved ones, him and her husband. Mom, he cried at the same time as his mom turned to look at him, her mouth opening as she started to call out, his father bursting into the room from behind her, a fearful look on his face as he started dashing towards him and his mother. It was the last time he would see either of his parents alive, as moments later the far wall of the room exploded, as with a single vicious swipe of its colossal, muscled arm, a monster wiped his mother and father from the face of the earth. Mom, Dad, he screamed, staggering backwards even as the far wall of the apartment collapsed, and parts of the floor in front of him began to give way. The sound of screaming and shouts of despair and terror sounding out all around him, even as the sound of alarms and sirens in the distance began to ring out. He ignored all this, though. Instead, all he could do was stare in mind-numbing terror at the colossal, titanic being that he could now see through the destroyed wall of his family's apartment. It was huge, standing far taller than many of the surrounding city blocks, on top of which it looked to be crafted out of nothing but pure muscle. But it wasn't just its height and stature that terrified him, though. It was the billowing hot steam that flowed off of its powerful form, and the look of absolute fury in its shadowed, glowing green eyes. Looking up at that moment, he knew only terror, dread, and absolute helplessness. This was it. He was about to die, just like his parents had just moments ago. This thing, this monster, it was going to kill him. Those were the last thoughts he had as he fell to the ground and pushed himself back against the far wall of the apartment, his heart still thundering in his chest, and tears still flowing from his eyes, blurring his vision as he saw the monster overhead open its giant maw and let loose another, deafening, bone-shaking scream. With a loud yell, he almost fell off of his bed due to how fast he had sat up, his strong, muscular body gleaming with sweat, and his heart beating rapidly in his broad chest, just like it had all those years ago, back on that night, the night when his life had changed forever. Gah! Katsuki Bakugo gasped out, his hands clenching and fists scrunching up the sweat-soaked blankets that had previously been covering him. It had happened again, that same recurring nightmare. His memory of the night the Titan had attacked. Still breathing heavily, he forced himself up out of his bed and onto his feet, his body still shaking. Even as sweat continued to bead on his forehead and drip down, soaking his spiky blonde hair. Taking slow and deep breaths, Bakugo slowly but surely began to calm down. That night had been 10 years ago now. It was in the past. Taking another deep breath, the spiky blonde headed for the door to his room, wearing nothing other than a pair of boxers, as he then threw the door open and headed over to the communal bathroom. Upon entering the room, he walked straight over to one of the sinks, ran a tap, and then splashed water onto his face. A few minutes passed as he leant against the sink, his heartbeat slowly calming, even as the sweat and water dripped off of his face and into the porcelain sink below. It had been 10 years, and still that night haunted him. The night his parents had been taken from him. The night he, like so many others, had been made homeless. 10 years might have passed, but he had not forgotten, nor had he fully recovered. The chill that ran up his spine every time he walked through the area his family had once lived, and the recurring nightmares that assailed him most nights told him that much. Taking one last deep breath, Katsuki stood up straight and looked into the bathroom mirror, his red eyes locking with his reflections, even as he grit his teeth and attempted to smile. He didn't succeed. Currently, Katsuki was living in a foster home, a dumping ground for unwanted kids. With his parents dead and his home destroyed, he had had nowhere else to go. Not with his grandparents, on both sides, having been killed years prior in villain attacks, and his parents having no siblings. He was the last of his family, and although his parents had been successful and had left a sizable estate for him in their will, he was not able to access it until he was of age. Until then, though, he was living as a ward of the state, an orphan. It was humiliating, but still, he wasn't about to complain. The foster home gave him bed and board. It gave him a place to sleep. This in turn allowed him to attend the local middle school, even if that school was in an entire different district than the one he likely would have attended were it not for that night. But no, that didn't matter either. The teachers at his old junior school had been a joke. They had praised him and made claims about him being destined for greatness, all when he hadn't even done anything yet, save of course for possessing a powerful quirk. Meaningless platitudes. A school like that would have only weakened him. No, he was content where he was. His current school was a place where he could not only work himself ragged to get the best results he could, but a place that encouraged him to, and, so long as he was willing to put the work in, went out of their way to help him achieve the best results he could. It also handily enough had a large gym facility, one in which he spent several hours every day after school working out and training, pushing his body to the absolute limits as he prepared himself for moving on up to his dream school, UA Academy. The best hero academy in Japan, and probably one of the best in the world. It was one of the most prestigious schools in the world, one that had birthed some of the greatest heroes of their time, including All Might and Endeavor. Katsuki grit his teeth again at that, his grimace turning into a fierce smile now. After all, soon it would boast one more alumni, its greatest yet. Katsuki Bakugo. Today was the day of the UA entrance exam, and he was going to completely crush it. He would destroy the previous record and tell the teachers that he was fucking here. He would rise to be the best in his year and the best in the school, and then, once he graduated, he would work his way up until he was a pro hero, the greatest of all time. The avenging hero, Nemesis. He had already decided on what his hero name would be. It would represent the kind of hero he endeavored to be, the kind that fought the strongest of foes, taking down the villains before they could hurt the innocent, and crushing them if he failed, and they did hurt the innocent. He wouldn't be a sword of justice, or a shield of righteousness. He would be the fucking nuclear warhead of retribution. Katsuki's grin turned almost feral at that thought, even as he remembered the look of fear on his mother's face one more time. Yes, today was the day. It was the day he had spent the last 10 years working towards. It was the day his heroic journey would begin, a day that would go down in fucking history. Later that same day at UA. Well, here I am. Izuku Midoriya muttered to himself as he came to a stop in front of a massive set of gates, dozens of other people around his own age filtering past him, even as he paused for a moment just so he could take in the grandeur of the sight in front of him. Honestly, he had never thought he would be here, and certainly not to take the entrance exam. Sure, he had trained for years, giving everything he had, blood, sweat, and tears, as he drove himself day after day, training his body, honing his mind, and practicing his quirk, all for this chance. But deep down, he had dreaded that he might never get the opportunity. For 10 years, ever since that night, he had pushed himself forward relentlessly, almost obsessively, not only so he could gain absolute control over his quirk, but also so he could apply to UA and become a hero, a proper hero. Not the one he had dreamed of back when he had been a child. After all, his dream of being a hero back then had been a vain, ego-driven dream. A dream of an immature child, one who just wanted to be special and to be seen. Izuku was no longer that child. The weight of his actions all those years ago and the depth of his remorse had forced him to grow up far faster than a child ever should. No longer did he want to be a hero for personal reasons. Though admittedly he would be lying if he didn't admit that the perks of being a hero, including the fame, respect, recognition, and honor, those things that came with working in the profession, wouldn't be appreciated. But no, mainly he wanted to become a hero as penance for his past sins. Yes, he had been told many times, and knew very well himself now, that it had not been his fault. He had been 5 years old, an immature child who awakened a quirk that was far too powerful and far too uncontrollable for him to manage. Incidents like what happened to him did happen. Still, despite knowing this, he was not deterred from his self-appointed duty. He would become a pro-hero no matter what, and then he would throw himself in the thickest of fighting and the most brutal of situations. 364 people. That was how many he had killed during his rampage, and that was at least how many people he would need save in order to balance his karmic ledger. After which he would then continue to dedicate himself to saving even more people, all in the name of those who had fallen. That said, though, his reasoning for becoming a hero was not just his own self-enforced penitence. It was also because, with the quirk he had both been blessed and cursed with, being a hero was the profession he could the most good in. Smiling to himself at that, though, Izuku clenched his hands into fists. Dr. Nakamura and all the other doctors back at Asphodel had all believed in him. Not only had they helped raise him, but they had provided him the opportunity to not only push himself to his limits, but to also then break through them. Sure, he knew they had had selfish personal reasons for doing so. They were doctors and scholars after all, and had wanted to experiment on him and his quirk. He was not naive enough to think that they were entirely altruistic. But still they had helped him, often going above and beyond, not only to help him gain control of his powerful quirk, but to develop it and learn how to fight and save lives with it. The staff back at Asphodel had been good to him, and he would always be eternally grateful to them for that, and for the support they had shown him back when he had first been institutionalized and said that he wanted to be a hero. Back then, despite his rampage and the deaths he had caused still being very fresh, they had not laughed at him or told him that he couldn't. Instead, they had encouraged his desire and provided him with the tools and support he needed to succeed. A slight smile continued to slowly spread across his face at that thought. Even as he looked up, his green eyes gleaming with anticipation and resolve as he beheld the grand entrance and the huge buildings that made up the main campus of the academy he was hoping to attend. He was finally here after years of training and preparing. He had made it to UA, one of the premier hero academies in the world, on a par with its North American and European counterparts. UA, one of the institutes that middle school students from almost every country and nation in the world wanted to attend, with the academy being well known and well respected throughout the world. Its sterling reputation attracting students from both Great Britain, North America, and beyond. Tens of thousands of teens from all over Japan and beyond applied to attend UA Academy, and this year, Izuku was one of the ones to be accepted and offered a chance to take the entrance exams. Thinking on it as he stood in front of the gates, the sheer amount of competition for the school was not all that surprising. In a world like the one Izuku lived, where 80% of the population had superpowers or quirks, becoming a pro hero was the standard dream that almost every kid had growing up. Gone were the days before quirks, when superpowers were only a fantasy and heroes only appeared in films and comic books. Back then the world idolized and looked up to actors, athletes, singers, and musicians. Now though, pro heroes were the rock stars and celebrities of the modern world, with even the low-level heroes being given respect and influence, as people the world over admired them for their selflessness and courage. Due to this, there were thousands of hero academies the world over, and hundreds in Japan alone, all of which, every year, churned out more and more teens, all of whom were looking to become pro heroes. Of those, a large proportion would succeed, even if not all of them would become super famous or well-known. After all, every country in the world had hundreds if not thousands of hero agencies dotted around them, in every town and city, with these offices being set up by either individual or groups of heroes as bases where they could work from to protect the people, as well as places where those heroes could pass on their wisdom and experience to the next generation. Izuku smiled fiercely at that, his anxiety over how he would be received by the other candidates fading away, as he instead focused on his goal to the exclusion of all else, his gleaming green eyes locking onto the large entrance overhead. This was going to be the start of Izuku's journey, as he fought and worked to become the greatest hero the world would ever see. Sometime later. "It's almost time," Izuku muttered to himself, his hands clenching into fists at his side, even as he walked through the milling crowds of similarly aged students around him. There were a lot of other applicants here, most of whom were waiting around patiently for the exam hall's doors to open. Some of them, however, were noticeably talking to other candidates, no doubt friends that they had already had, or people that they had already known before the exam had started. Others, meanwhile, like Izuku, were silent and watchful, some of them scoping out the competition, whilst others just stood still, no doubt trying to remain calm or trying to psyche themselves up for the events to come. Standing calmly just slightly outside of the main mass of students, Izuku noticed a few people looking curiously over at him, some of them eyeing him up, as if looking to see whether or he would be troublesome competition going forwards, whilst others just glanced at him and then away, dismissing him entirely. It appeared none of them knew who he was, or at least not yet. Then again, that wasn't that surprising. The event he had been involved in had been 10 years ago, and with villains' attacks or disruption occurring on an almost weekly basis, the public had a very short attention span. On top of which, Izuku's picture had never been shared with news companies, even if his name had leaked out. So yes, although no one here seemed to recognize him, a part of him suspected that some of the people here will have at least heard of him, even in passing. Mainly those who were affected directly, though there would be some who would remember the night of great loss. After all, it had shook the country at the time, and had been headline news for months afterwards. Even to this day, it had been noted down as one of the most destructive and deadly Quirk-related incidents in the last decade. Notably, the events of that night were officially referred to as a Quirk-related incident, and not a villain attack or incident. Though that was because, as a 5-year-old at the time and a minor, he was not considered a villain, on top of which his actions were not deemed as malicious or deliberate. As he was thinking about this, his gaze still panning around the crowd of students, a sudden ringing sound pulled Izuku from his thoughts, even as the double doors to the large building in front of them opened up. Following the crowd, Izuku headed inside, mentally preparing himself for the trials to come as he did so. After all, thousands of people applied to get onto UA's hero course each year, and of those thousands, many of them were rejected. In fact, only the cream of the crop being allowed to attend the UA hero course, with the course itself only having 40 places on it each year, which of course meant that the competition for a place was always stiff. Still, it was for this reason that they had the exams, with the first of them being a written exam, testing not only a candidate's academic knowledge, but also their situational awareness, their morality, and how they would analyze and then adapt to a hypothetical situation. It was to this written test that Izuku was heading, following the rest of the crowd as he entered the pre-designated building he was supposed to be taking his exam in. With Izuku having been given a registration card alongside his letter of invitation, one that included his examinee number, the building he was to take his written exam in, and which arena his practical test would be taken in, back when the principal had visited Asphodel a month ago. Thinking back on that, Izuku bit his lip slightly. He hadn't actually gotten the chance to speak to the principal back then, despite him thinking that that was the reason for the man's visit. Instead, the man had just talked to the doctors, gone through his private file, including his psychological profile, and then left. Apparently, the principal didn't want to be accused of special treatment by the media or by parents of rejected students, which would almost certainly be the case if it became known that the principal of UA had met with and spoken to one of the candidates before he took the test. Or at least that was the excuse the Dr. Nakamura had passed on to him. Shaking his head again and digging his clipped fingernails into his palm, Izuku focused on the matter at hand. He couldn't let himself be distracted, not now of all times. 4 hours later. Oh, finally, it's over, Izuku muttered to himself, massaging his temples as 4 hours later, he walked down UA's main plaza completely oblivious to anyone else as he tried to wind down after finishing the demanding written portion of the test. The set of exams he had just taken were far harder than he had thought they would be, but still he had managed to answer them. Say what you will about growing up in a government facility, but the doctors and staff there had certainly provided him with the best in terms of education. Even so, though, the exam he had just taken had still been trying, even for Izuku, who, although not as intelligent as some, those who had intelligence-based quirks, was still academically gifted. After taking a moment to think about it, though, he quickly realized that he should have known that this would be the case. Approximately 2,500 candidates were said to be taking the entrance exams this year, with those groups being separated into 24 different groups of around 100, with the exams stretching over the course of 3 days, with 8 groups taking part each day. Of these 2,500 candidates, only 40 would be able to join the hero course. Izuku already knew it was going to be competitive getting in, but having just taken the written tests, he now understood just how hard it was going to be. Still, he was ready, and he had prepared. He had not spent the last 10 years training and working himself to exhaustion just to fail at the first hurdle. The written exam, though difficult, had gone well. Next up was the practical. Izuku nodded to himself at that, his unrelenting confidence and determination once again renewed, and the fire within him burning hotter than ever as he pushed his thoughts of the written exam to one side, and instead focused on the next part of the exam. It's fucking time. Izuku growled to himself, the skin over his hands shifting a silvery blue color, even as he loudly slammed them together in front of him. It was time to get himself pumped up. Grinning to himself at that, Izuku headed towards the large auditorium within which the briefing for the physical part of the test would take place. Unfortunately, though, before he was interrupted by someone stepping in front of him, a stern look on their face. "Excuse me." A loud, unyielding voice suddenly snapped. The voice interrupting Izuku from his, by this point, standard introspection, as he instead looked up at the speaker, his expression firming and his jaw tightening as he prepared himself for a confrontation. Only for his hard, green eyes to lock onto a young, bespectacled teen with a powerful build, short black hair, and a stern expression etched onto his face. The boy in question standing right in front of him, blocking his way. "Can you please stop swearing? And also, the use of quirks outside of designated areas is prohibited. I saw what you just did. As a prospective UA student, you should know that such behavior is both distracting and not at all appropriate." The glasses-wearing teen rattled off, his oddly shaped eyebrows furrowed, as he unexpectedly lectured him about the rules of all things. Izuku cocked his head to the side as took in the boy's lecture. A part of him not at all sure what to think or do as the taller boy got up in his face, waving a finger under Izuku's nose as he attempted to scold him like a parent would an unruly child. Now, growing up in a juvenile detention facility, Izuku was not the most social adept of people. Sure, he had met and been educated alongside other kids back in the facility, both those that were like him and had had no control over their quirks, and those that had control over their quirks but had been caught abusing them on more than one occasion. Not the violent offenders, though. They were kept separate from the rest. But still, he was sociable enough when in a controlled area. He had conversed, laughed with, and even befriended, sort of, girls and boys both older and younger than him. But this wasn't a controlled area, and this was a team that he doubted he had anything in common with, save of course for the fact that they both wanted to be heroes. So honestly, he was feeling a bit out of his element here. Still knew he couldn't just ignore the other teen. So instead, he would just do what he did best. He would be blunt and speak his mind. "Sorry, I won't do it again," Izuku began, deciding to be diplomatic to begin with. "So can you get out of my face now? You're being very rude and distracting." The other boy blinked in surprise, looking shocked for a second as he heard Izuku's response, his eyes widening almost comically before an affronted expression crossed his face. "What's your name? I am going to be reporting you to the nearest teacher for your behavior." One again, Izuku looked surprised. This guy was kind of an arsehole. He had said he was sorry, so what was this guy's problem? "Who are you?" The boy in front of him scowled as Izuku didn't answer the question, but just asked his own question in response. Puffing up a bit at that and glaring down his nose at Izuku, the boy then spoke again. "My name is Tenya Ida, from Some Private School." "Now, okay, well, I suppose it's nice to meet you. Tenya Ida, from Some Private School. Now can you please go away and bother someone else? I've got to get to the candidate briefing and you're in my way." Izuku once again replied bluntly. He didn't want to be rude to this guy. After all, he could be a future classmate. But still, his attitude was starting to irk him, and Izuku didn't like being irked, nor did he like, or accept, being pushed around or browbeaten. "You've still not told me who you are. Did your mother teach you no manner?" The now named Ida replied hotly, clearly beginning to get annoyed by Izuku's attitude. "My mother's dead," Izuku replied bluntly, his tone now stone cold as he frowned slightly at Ida, his hands unconscious balling into fists, even as the same silvery blue sheen as before covered them. Oh, well, Ida trailed off, his face going a bit pale, and his mouth slack as he floundered about, unsure how to respond to Izuku's abrupt statement of fact. I mean, well, I'm sorry, and okay, cool. Well, I'll see you later, Ida. Izuku quickly replied, being deliberately glib now even as he sidestepped the taller boy, his brow furrowing, even as he kept his hands clenched into fists. The abrasive teen had annoyed him, but he wasn't going to make a scene. Hey, wait! Ida shouted after Izuku, twisting around so as to follow the other teen and no doubt continue his lecture, only for his eyes to widen as he realized that he also needed to get to the briefing for the physical portion of the exam too. A few minutes later, after quickly escaping that abrasive Ida kid, Izuku headed for the school's auditorium, following the rest of the candidates heading in that direction. As he did so, he couldn't help but look around at some of the other UA hopefuls that he passed, some of whom just looked completely ordinary with normal colored hair, eyes, and body shapes, whilst others looked distinctly unique, with one of the students he passed having rock-like skin, whilst another had bright pink skin and horns, and yet another had the head of a bird and yet the body of a human. Looking around at the students as he merged with the crowd, Izuku's analytical mind was a whir of motion. He had always loved examining, breaking down, and analyzing both heroes and villains and their quirks. It was something of a hobby of his, and already back at the small yet comfortable flat he had been set up in, thanks to the government, he had a large stack of notebooks filled to the brim with notes he had written on hundreds of heroes and villains. The unusual appearances of some of those he passed, he knew, were down to two reasons. The first of which being that person's quirk. After all, some quirks mutated a person's appearance because of the way they worked, requiring physical changes for it to operate. The second possible reason, meanwhile, was that they could have inherited their appearances from their parents, who themselves gained the unusual features from their quirks or through inheriting traits from their parents, meaning that their inhuman looks in no way related to what their own quirk did, but was what they were born like. Izuku knew that he himself looked like a normal human, well, a very fit and healthy human, but a normal human all the same, just like his parents had. Though that said, he did have dark green hair, which he knew wasn't entirely normal, but nor was it a mutation as extreme as some of the UA candidates he passed. Not that appearances mattered at all in the grand scheme of things. No, in this superhuman society that they lived in, all that truly mattered was a person's quirk. Those that had a powerful one would succeed, and for the most part have an easy life. Those with a weak one would struggle and have to work twice as hard to succeed. It wasn't fair, but nor was life. Joining the crowd of other candidates, all shuffling into the building, Izuku soon entered as well, letting out a slight whistle as he did so, and looked around and saw just how big the room inside was. It was a massive room, with rows upon rows of seats going in a big circle all the way around, the seats all being tiered so as to allow everyone to have a good view of the main stage. Walking up the steps, Izuku quickly took his seat, sitting next to the girl he had seen before outside the auditorium. It was a girl that looked to be around the same age as Izuku himself. Only unlike him, she had bright pink skin and unusual eyes, which had black sclera and yellow irises. The girl also had unruly, short pink hair quite similar to Izuku's own when he occasionally grew it out, except her own hair was pink. Oh, and it had a pair of sharp golden-colored horns protruding out of it. Overall, though, the girl cut a striking figure, one that Izuku knew would make her a popular hero if she graduated. After all, the more striking the hero, and the flashier their quirk, the more popular they would be, and thus the more famous and financially successful. On the other side of Izuku's seat, there was another girl, he suspected based off of the baggy, pink and white tracksuit and the build. That said, he couldn't be entirely sure, not when, other than her clothes and shoes, the girl was completely invisible. Izuku frowned at that curiously. Was that because she was already using her quirk? Or maybe it was because she was one of those few who always had their quirk active, no matter what? Shaking that thought out of his head, Izuku took his seat, the horn girl next to him glancing over at him, a large smile spreading across her face as she looked him up and down. As for the other girl, well, her tracksuit shifted, but he wasn't sure whether that meant she had turned to look at him, or had just moved slightly in his seat. It wasn't quite clear. Hey there, I'm Mina Ishido. The girl said brightly, even as she thrust her hand out to Izuku, her grin widening as he took it and gave it a brief shake. Looking down at it, Izuku took a deep breath and decided that it was time. He would have to do it sooner or later, and this girl seemed nice enough, far more so than that Ida kid from before. Hey, I'm Izuku Midoriya. Izuku replied uncomfortably, reaching out for the girl's hand, but not quite taking it. Midoriya? Mina hummed, taking his hand and shaking it cheerfully, after which she released it and tilted her head to the side, a cute, thoughtful look on her face. I feel like I've heard that name before. Izuku suppressed a wince at that. Wait, I know. The invisible girl next to him chirped up, catching Izuku's attention as he twisted and looked to the girl. I remember seeing a documentary a few years back. It was about the night of great loss. Again, Izuku had to hold back a wince. Oh, of course. You were that 5-year-old kid who lost control and went mental, weren't you? Mina said, her smile dimming slightly as she spoke. Wow, that must have been rough. I heard a lot of people died back then. Yeah, it was all over the news. I remember learning about it in school. The invisible girl nodded, before she paused, no doubt seeing the tense expression on Izuku's face. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to call you out or anything. I know it wasn't your fault. I mean, you were 5. I just remembered hearing your name before. That's all. It's fine, Izuku said after a few moments, his tone a bit stiff. It's just not something I like to think back on. Yeah, I imagine not. Mina muttered, a look of sadness now on her face. Still, it's in the past, right? And you must have full control over your quirk now if UA let you try out, right? Right, yeah. Izuku nodded a bit nonplussed as he saw the pink-haired girl not only not shirk away from him, but regain a bit of her previous spark. Well, that's all that matters, isn't it? It was horrible, but it was an accident, right? There is no undoing what's in the past, but you can't let it dominate your present. The invisible girl said, and Izuku felt a soft, invisible hand patting his hand as she spoke. Oh, and I'm Toru Hagakure, by the way. Nice to meet you. Izuku nodded, a slight smile on his face now. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting. Yeah, nice to meet you, Hagakure. Mina chirped, once again on high note as she nonchalantly reached across Izuku. Uncaring of the awkward position, she put him in as she pressed her mature body against his. Her hand extended and a bright smile on her face as she went to greet the invisible girl. Yeah, you too, Hagakure replied, equally cheerfully. So anyway, that other stuff aside, how did you two do on the written exam? I did terrible. I only hope I am able to make up my points in the physical test. Mina suddenly said in a bubbly tone, not batting an eye, or at all embarrassed, as she admitted that she hadn't done well in the written tests. Oh, I didn't do too badly. It was really hard, but I think that I at least got better than half marks. Hagakure chipped in cheerfully, her bright, optimistic personality matching well with Mina's. What about you, Midoriya? Me? Well, I don't think I did too badly. Izuku muttered in reply, shifting slightly as he felt the gazes of both girls on him. So is that just it? They weren't going to mention the incident again? But like you say, Ishido, this test should hopefully be easier. Yeah, hopefully. Mina nodded with a grin, raising her hand and clenching it into a fist as she did so. I wonder what it'll be, though. With my quirk, I think I should be able to do pretty well. Oh really, what is your quirk? If you don't mind me asking. Hagakure jumped back into the conversation, a tone of curiosity in her voice as she, like Izuku, pondered whether it had something to do with Mina's striking appearance. I mean, mine is pretty obvious. I'm invisible. Yeah, I can see that. It looks awesome. As for me, well, I can create acid and secrete it from my skin and stuff. It's pretty cool as I can change how corrosive it is and how thick it is and things like that. Mina replied, her cheerfulness not diminishing in the slightest. They both sound like really good quirks. Izuku spoke up, beginning to regain his bearings now he was fully confident that neither of the two were going to snap at him or be afraid, with Mina beaming at him in delight at his compliment. What abo? Hagakure spoke up, a note of interest in her voice as he clothing shifted turned to face him. However, before any more could be said, she was interrupted by the lights in the auditorium noticeably dimming and a hush falling over the waiting students. Oh, Wait a sec, I think the briefing is about to start. Hagakure then continued, completely changing tack now, even as both Izuku and Mina looked down at the main stage. Right. Mina replied with a nod, turning in her seat like Izuku as they both looked down at the stage in the center of the auditorium. The tension and anticipation in the room noticeably building as the many UA hopefuls waited for the briefing on the last part of the entrance exam to start. Moments later, as the room fell silent and the main lights in the room dimmed, the feeling of anticipation began to grow amongst the waiting UA candidates. As the seconds stretched on, the anticipation continued to build, with mutterings starting to break out, until suddenly, it stopped when the stage was abruptly lit up. The spotlights now on the stage revealing someone patiently waiting in the center. It was a man, one who had excessively spiky and wild blonde hair that extended over a foot above his head, a pair of orange-tinted glasses, and some kind of contraption around his neck. Something that looked like a big speaker, only with it being in the shape of a collar. Despite his unique appearance, though, pretty much everyone in the auditorium recognized who this man was in an instant. This was the pro hero known as Present Mike, a well-known hero who taught here at UA, plus a well-known radio DJ too. Welcome everyone to my live show. Present Mike shouted the moment the lights turned on, a large smile on his face as he thrust both hands out to either side of him, jabbing his fingers at the waiting crowd of candidates, his voice sounding out loud and overly enthusiastic. Everybody say HEY. In response, there was only stunned silence, as the building tension and anticipation was well and truly shattered by the eccentric hero's actions. Seeing the response, Present Mike put one of his hands against his ear, undeterred as he used his other hand to wave at the crowd of students. Come on, one more time, everybody say HEY. Again there was silence. Oh, tough crowd, Present Mike said, his grin not faltering for an instant as he instead began to address the crowd, getting on with what he was really here for. Whatever. Now I'm going to give you all the rundown on how the practical exam is going to go down. Are you all ready? This time some of the students reacted, a couple of them shouting, yeah. The majority, however, remained silent, either due to them being nervous over the exam to come, or because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, or because they just lacked a sense of humor. Haha. Good, now I want you all to pay attention, as I'm only going to be saying this once. Present Mike shouted in response, his voice amplified by the speakers around his neck as he struck yet another dramatic pose before continuing on with his speech. Now the physical part of the exams will be testing whether you have the skills to be a hero. After this briefing, you will be going to one of UA's replica city districts. You can take whatever equipment you want. Just gather at your designated meeting area after my presentation. Hearing that, Izuku looked down at the registration card he had been given along with his invitation to take the exams, the card showing the letter E. Seeing this, Izuku then glanced over at Mina's card, noticing as he did that she was checking his card out too. You got Arena E2? Yep, it looks like we'll be in the same arena. Mina replied with a smile, bumping Izuku's shoulder with her own as she did so. I'm in Arena A, Hagakure said from beside them. That's not that bad. I'm sure you'll still crush it. Mina cheered, once again leaning over the bemused Izuku as she spoke to the invisible girl, her pink hand clenched into a fist as she cheered the invisible girl on. Yeah, you too. Hagakure shot back. Thanks. Izuku nodded, a light smile on his face. Things were going better than he thought they would go. With that thought in mind, he tuned back into what Present Mike was saying as the blonde-haired pro hero forged on with his explanation of the practical exam. Now listen up, all of you kids. There'll be loads of faux villains spread all over the battlefields, and each one will be rated as either a 1, 2, or 3-pointer, depending on what type it is. Your job is to use your quirk to take out as many of them as you can and rack up a high score. But there are rules. You can't attack other competitors directly. That's nasty anti-hero stuff, and we'll see any student doing it disqualified. Present Mike shouted out again, outlining the rules even as several large overhead screens powered up at his words, showing the dark outlines of 3 different robots, each of which had a number from 1 to 3 posted next to it. Excited whispers began to fill the hall as the waiting students listened in on present Mick's explanation. Before the man could continue, however, a stern, and to Izuku familiar, voice suddenly spoke out, stopping present Mike from continuing and drawing all the attention in the room to the speaker. Seeing who it was that was speaking, Izuku couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Excuse me," Tenya Ida said loudly, the well-built, bespectacled boy standing up, a stern expression on his face as he looked down at present Mike. "On the handout we received, there are clearly 4 types of villains listed. If this is an error, then it's a huge embarrassment for a top-tier international academy of UA's caliber. What is the meaning of this?" "We were given a handout," Izuku muttered to Mina, getting a shrug from the girl in response. Now, no need to worry." Present Mike spoke up, pointing dramatically at the teen with the glasses. "Though you do make a good point, young man. So let me explain. The 4th type of villain is called the zero-pointer. It's a big, gimmicky thing that goes wild in tight places. If I were you, I'd do my best to avoid that sucker." "I see. Forgive my interruption," Ida replied, giving a half bow to the amused-looking pro-hero before primly sitting down. Seeing this, Izuku could already see an issue arising in the future. If that Ida guy ended up being in the same class as him, he suspected the two of them might not get along all that well, not with that he had seen of the other teen's attitude thus far. "Well, I think that's enough from me," Present Mike continued, even as he grinned around at the waiting candidates. "I think I'll leave you with a quote that my academy prides itself on. Go beyond. Plus ultra. Now get out there, you crazy kids, and have a great time." Izuku grinned as he heard that, his hands clenching into fists as he readied himself for the task ahead. Go beyond. He liked the sound of that, and it was exactly what he was going to do. He would take this opportunity and prove to all the teachers of UA that he had what it took to be a hero. On the front row of the stand, some 50 meters from where Izuku was sat, Katsuki Bakugo grinned fiercely. His red eyes gleamed with anticipation as he readied himself for the challenge ahead. It was time for him to show the teachers of UA what he was made of. Izuku couldn't help but grin in excitement as he looked over at the large, and apparently fake, city district in front of him. This was it, the last exam, the last hurdle, before he could enter UA and begin his journey to becoming a hero. Looking out over the arena, Izuku could only shake his head in awe. The fake city district was huge. It must be a mile-square block of buildings and roads. It was pretty damn impressive. It was incredibly realistic, too. To Izuku's eyes, it looked almost as if he were looking at an actual, admittedly quiet, city district on the outskirts of Tokyo. Honestly, the amount of time, money, and resources that must have gone into its construction had to have been phenomenal. The city block must be at least a mile wide and another mile deep, with numerous large tower blocks dotted throughout it, and apartment blocks, hundreds of narrow streets and roads. The entire thing looked like it had just been lifted from a real city. Hell, it even had a few cars dotted around the roads, as well as working lamp posts, and what looked like bus stops and fire hydrants. It would be both a very fun place, a very hard place, to fight in, and to hunt robot enemies in. "Oh wow, this place is huge, isn't Izuku? Actually, it might be too big. I mean, come on, it's massive, isn't it? I mean, it's so big, I don't even know how in hell we are going to find any of those robot things." Mina rattled off rapidly, her eyes shining brightly as she blathered away from her position next to him, her head twisting this way and that as she tried to take it all in. With the pink-skinned girl having not quite overcome her awe at the replica city. That said, though, despite her enthusiasm, the bubbly girl was still able to focus on the task to come, enough so that she had been able to work out the possible issues they might have finding robots in a place that both that large and with that many narrow roads. Izuku didn't answer at first. Instead, he continued to stare out at the arena, just as the other candidates around him did. This was a damn sight more impressive than the training facilities he had been allowed to use in Asphodel. Yeah, it's big. It must have been pretty expensive to build, too. It kind of makes feel bad, though. I mean, it's probably going to be wrecked in the exam, Izuku said bluntly, looking around at the 100 or so students surrounding him as he did so. After all, with people freely using their quirks to take down and fight the robots in the city district, well, there would inevitably be a lot of destruction. Mina rolled her eyes as she heard that and looked over at Izuku, an amused expression on her face. I think the general idea is that you try not to destroy the city. I don't think trashing things would be seen as being very heroic. It would probably be much easier, though. Izuku muttered, scuffing one of his feet along the floor as he did so. Already he could imagine just how much easier this would be if he took on his Titan form and rampaged through the city, like he had back on that night, but in a far more controlled, deliberate, and methodical manner. Unfortunately, though, as he knew from experience, such a tactic would lead to a lot of destruction and might even endanger the other students due to falling debris. Such a thing was not acceptable, not when he was trying to be a hero and to prove the naysayers that he was in control of his quirk and that he wasn't a danger anymore. He already had seen video footage from the night he had first taken his Titan form. He had seen one city district burn. He didn't want to see another one do the same due to him, even a fake one like the arena before them. Yeah, I can see what you mean. It would be so much easier for people like you. You know, those guys with flashy quirks, if you just went all out and destroyed stuff. But it would be a pain for the rest of us. Mina replied, her smile dimming slightly as she did so. I just wish my quirk had a bit more power to it. My quirk is good and all, but there is only so much acid I can create and throw around. That's not a bad thing. It just means you'll need to fight smart at times when you can't just rely on brute power. Izuku replied dryly. Plus, I reckon the UA staff took things like that into account when planning the exam. It's probably why they stuck it in a city to begin with. I mean, we are more likely to be fighting villains in built-up areas than in open spaces. So this is probably just seeing how we do fighting in enclosed spaces. They probably want to see how we can adapt and whether we learn how to do it without creating too much collateral damage. Yeah, that makes sense. Mina nodded, a bright smile once again on her face as she glanced over at the taller, green-haired teen. So anyway, Midoriya, do you fancy sticking together in there? You know, work together to take down as many as possible? Thanks for the offer, but I think sticking together would probably make it harder for both of us to rack up the big points. I mean, it'll probably be easier for both of us if we split up. That way we won't be stealing one another points or accidentally getting in each other's way. Izuku replied awkwardly. He liked Mina and didn't want to offend her or push her away. At the same time, though, he didn't think working together in an exam like this would be that good of an idea. Oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Mina grinned, rubbing the back of her head as she did so. I guess I didn't think that through properly. It's cool. I reckon the two of us would be great if we did work together, though. Who knows? Maybe if we both get into the academy, we could get the chance in one of the training sessions. Izuku smiled. Inwardly, he was pretty glad he hadn't pushed the friendly pink-skinned girl away with his refusal. Definitely. Mina grinned brightly. Izuku smiled back at that, even as he turned and looked around at the rest of the applicants. There were quite a lot of them, all of them wearing tracksuits, like that Ida kid, or homemade costumes. It kind of made Izuku feel a little unprepared. After all, he was just wearing trainers, sweatpants, a baggy, plain purple shirt, and black waterproof jacket. Hardly the most suitable of clothing. Unfortunately, though, they were the clothes he had been given upon leaving Asphodel, and thus they were the only clothes he owned at the moment. After all, he hadn't had the chance to go clothes shopping yet, or even food shopping for that matter. It was on his list of things to do after the exam, though. Plus, fortunately, his monthly bursary from the government had come in last night, so he could actually afford to splurge a little on the essentials, as well as to pay the rent at the apartment he had been set up at. Shaking his head as such mundane thoughts besieged him, Izuku instead focused on the task at hand. He was here at UA, about to take an exam, and surrounded by nearly 100 teens, all of whom were prospective students, and all of whom had unique, powerful, and flashy quirks. He could think about his chores later. For now, it was time for him to do what he did best and geek out. With that in mind, he quickly began to look around at all of the other students, trying to scope out what their quirks were and how they could be used. Already he could see quite a few interesting quirks from just a first glance. Just a dozen feet to his left, there was a pretty girl with short black hair, piercing dark eyes, and what looked like wires, almost like earphone jacks, coming down from her earlobes. A few feet away from her, he could see another teen. Only this one's body seemed to be completely made out of metal. Plus, there was another girl, also very pretty, who had green, literally, vine-like hair, and delicate, almost angelic features, as well as a body to die for. Izuku shook his head at that last thought, and instead tried to get his mind back on the matter at hand and away from distracting thoughts about girls. This, of course, wasn't helped by his new friend, Mina, the attractive, yet exotic-looking girl having just started doing some rather provocative stretches as she prepared for the exam to start. Damn it, his less-than-normal upbringing at a juvenile detention center had not equipped him for situations like this. Closing his eyes, Izuku began to go through some breathing exercise, first inhaling deeply and then exhaling. Starting to mentally prepare himself for the challenge to come, the silvery blue sheen once again covering his hands as he forced the images of all the attractive and striking girls out of his mind and focused on the exam. Already he could feel the strength and power flowing through his limbs, just below his skin. Clenching his hands into fists, Izuku let out a deep breath, hot steam erupting from his mouth, even as wisps of it began to flow off of his body. From beside him, he saw Mina send him a surprised look. No doubt the stretching girl had just noticed that the ambient temperature in the area around him had just raised several degrees. It was a side effect of his quirk. It was almost like his body started overheating when he started using the strength and regeneration part of his quirk, and thus released that heat outwardly in order to cool him down. It was far worse in his Titan form. In fact, the steam that emanated off of him when he was stood still and his Titan form was so hot that prolonged contact with it could scald people's flesh. Even now, he could remember seeing a lobster-pink doctor dancing around in pain after he had gotten too close to Izuku whilst he was in his Titan form. Letting out another breath and another hiss of steam, Izuku felt his muscles tighten and his strength grow as he drew on his quirk, not taking on his Titan form, but dancing around the cusp of doing so, his knuckles cracking as he clenched his fists tighter. He was ready for this. "Okay, everybody start." The voice of Present Mike suddenly rang out, drawing everybody's attention to where the pro hero was standing on a nearby observation tower. All of the candidates around Izuku looking at one another in confusion before looking back to Present Mike and waiting for him to continue. Before anyone could ask, though, the pro hero just laughed before yelling out again so all the participants could hear. "Well, come on then. What are you waiting for? There isn't a countdown in a real battle. You greenhorns, get those legs moving." A few moments later, there was a sudden silence after Present Mike made his announcement, all of the prospective students pausing for a moment as what the pro hero just said slowly filtered through their minds. Izuku, like the others, paused as he heard what the eccentric man had said, but unlike the others, he had already powered himself up and was ready to leap into action at a moment's notice, which is exactly what he did. With barely a thought, Izuku bent his legs and exploded forwards, his arms and legs pumping as he rapidly propelled himself through the crowd of waiting students. Izuku literally leaping over several confused students as he entered the replica city district. The first in his group to do so, which also gave him the advantage of being able to engage the enemy first and get in a few kills before the rest of the panicking students cocked onto what was happening and caught up with him. Not pausing for a second once he entered the city, Izuku continued moving, eating up the distance as he pumped his enhanced muscles, ignoring as he did so the shouts and exclamations coming from behind him as the other students all caught onto what was happening. He would not let them distract him from his goal. Rushing through the streets, Izuku soon caught up to the first foe villain, a big bulky robot with 4 legs and what looked like 2 Gatling guns for arms. Not that this gave Izuku pause, as with his healing factor, he could easily tank a shower of bullets without issue, on top of which his enhanced strength fed into his speed, meaning that he was far faster than an average human, fast enough to not outrun a bullet, but to quickly react when if he saw a gun training in on him. Not that Izuku was going to give the robot a chance to fire on him, of course. No, because that would be stupid. With that in mind, he continued forward, his right hand drawn back, and his fist glowing a slivery blue color, as with grunt he lashed out at the robot as he passed by. His technique for the punch was perfect, and his timing was 1 point. But for the moment, he was relying on hit and run tactics. 1 punch should be enough to take out one of these robots. After all, with them being robots, he didn't have to hold back on the strength of his punches. With a grinding of metal on metal, the robot quickly turned to face Izuku as he rushed it, its Gatling guns already beginning to spin as it prepared to fire. Before the robot could get off even one shot, though, Izuku was in front of it, his blurring forwards. Before, with the sound of shattering metal, he cleaved right through it, his fist smashing through the front of its chest and out the other side in an explosive of broken metal and circuit boards. That's 3 points. Izuku muttered to himself as he literally ran through the destroyed three-pointer robot, ignoring the shrapnel that rained down all around him as he did so. And soon another 3. Izuku continued with a grin as he thundered forward into another three-point robot, his hardened fist lashing out again, and he decimated this robot too, not even break step as he continued forward. Continuing on through the rubble, Izuku headed towards the center of the city, where he guessed most of the robots would be gathered, destroying any robot that got into his immediate path as he did so. Like he had, though, with how weak his opponents were, and the fact he didn't have to hold back, he only needed a single enhanced punch to destroy them, even the three-pointers. Letting out another breath and a hiss of steam, he then continued to thunder through the city, a determined expression on his face as he darted from robot to robot, occasionally passing another competitor as he weaved through the narrow streets, using his enhanced strength to leap forwards as much as 10 feet at a time. Already he knew that he was quickly racking up the points. From his count, he had gotten nearly 50 points by the time 10 minutes of the 15-minute exam had passed, and he still had another 5 to go. Another minute or so passed, with Izuku leaping through the street, occasionally using the sides of buildings as a platform to leap off of as he shot through the narrow streets, looking for foes. It was as he was doing this, however, that he found himself faced with a problem, which is to say he was finding it hard to, well, find the enemy. As the more time passed, the less robots seemed to be left, Izuku and the other students having vastly whittled down their number. This had turned into a bit of a problem for Izuku. Like he had thought, an area the size of the arena was making things difficult, especially with the hundreds of narrow streets and all of the competition he was facing. On top of which, his quirk was no help to him in this situation. He had no way of scoping out or finding the enemy, save for doing it the old-fashioned way, which is to say by using his enhanced physical attributes to cover as much ground as he could as fast as he could, his green eyes flicking this way and that as he dodged around other candidates, severed around corners, and occasionally took to the roofs of buildings, as he determinedly tried to find more robots to destroy. "Hey, that one was mine," a kid suddenly shouted out, the boy in question being very short with what looked like purple balls on his head instead of hair. His voice somewhat lispy and his face petulant as he scowled over at Izuku. Clearly the kid was irritated that he had just dropped from the sky and landed feet first on a one-point robot that had been about to attack the other kid from behind. "Sorry, I thought you hadn't seen it," Izuku replied sheepishly as he glanced down at the shattered remains of the robot under his feet. He kind of felt guilt now. After all, if the other boy had known it was there, then that meant he had effectively stolen his kill. Not that Izuku felt too bad about it. This was a competitive process, an exam, after all. With that thought in mind, Izuku ignored the kid and instead ran forward and leapt again, pushing off of a nearby building and propelling himself to another as he did so. He didn't have the time to feel sorry for or worry about another applicant. Not when there was still time on the clock. A few minutes later, "Hey Midoriya, how are you doing?" The cheerful voice of Mina called out a few minutes later, a smile on her face as she turned from a half-dissolved robot and instead grinned at Izuku, her golden eyes twinkling as she saw the green-haired teen leap from a rooftop and crash into the ground a few feet from her, the concrete under his feet cracking as he did so, even as steam continued to flow off of his body. "Yeah, not too bad," Izuku replied as he scanned the area, seeing only shattered robot parts and broken buildings around him. "How about you? Been having any trouble?" Mina shrugged in response, her smile dimming for the first time since he met her. "Yeah, I've got around 38 points so far. I would have had more, but I ended up helping out a few other students who got themselves into trouble. It wasted a bit of time, which is annoying, but I reckon I would have felt pretty shitty if I hadn't helped out." Izuku nodded at that. He understood exactly what she meant, as earlier on in the test he had noticed a lot of wannabe heroes running off into the city. Some of them having no strategy in mind as they just looked for as many robots as they could, even if it meant getting trapped in a narrow alley and putting themselves in danger. Izuku had also ended up helping a couple of other applicants out as he passed, but not without reason. After all, by destroying the robots attacking them, he had been able to rack up even more points. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. He helped them out and stopped them from being hurt or taken out of the exam, and in return he got villain points. It was sort of like they were the bait, and he was a helpful predator. There's still time. Besides, I am sure they will notice how you helped other people. Izuku replied with a smile, trying to buoy the girl up. Plus, he didn't think that the test would be as cut and dry as kill this amount of robots, and you passed. There were bound to be other factors. Lateral thinking, that was what Dr. Nakamura had always tried to ingrain into him. Don't take things as just black and white, and don't just take things as they seem on the outside. Yeah, definitely. Mina replied with a grin, the bubbly pink-skinned girl not staying down for long. How many have you got? I've got 59 at the moment. I just need one more. Izuku replied as he looked around, scanning the area for more robots as he did so. I've got my work cut out for me then. Mina replied with a competitive grin at Izuku, not at all concerned with the fact his score was higher than hers at the moment, as she instead turned and ran forwards. As she did so, Izuku could only watch as she sent out a spray of acid in front of her, soaking the ground in front of her, even as she used the acid to increase her speed as she slid along the concrete. Hey, wait! Izuku shouted in response as he turned around and leapt after her, the concrete beneath his feet cracking as he erupted from a cloud of steam and clambered up the side of a building, his hardened fingers gouging into the concrete and bricks walls as he climbed up the side of the tall building like a giant, human-sized spider, before he then pushed off of it, leaping to another building and then again. His method of travel not only allowing him to negotiate the streets without tripping over all of his other competitors that were milling down below, but it gave him more of an aerial, which made searching for robot foes easier. Continuing on through the city, Izuku grinned as he saw Mina shooting ahead of him, the pink-haired girl easily destroying 1 point robots in a single sweep as she unleashed a spray of corrosive acid. Nodding his head at that, Izuku landed on the side of a tower block, his fingers digging grooves into the side of the wall as he began to crawl up it, using his heightened strength and hardened skin to dig himself handholds. 2 minutes remaining. The voice of Present Mike suddenly rang out. The sound of his voice, amplified as it was through his quirk, being easily audible in all of the arenas and for all of the students taking their exams. Narrowing his eyes as he heard that, Izuku then leapt off the building, his sharp eyes narrowing as he saw a 2-point robot in the street below, the medium-sized faux villain weaving between the rubble and its destroyed counterparts as it headed down the street to where a small melee was taking place between the squabbling students and the remaining robots. Landing on the ground with a crunch, Izuku had to hold back a wince, pushing back the sudden flare of pain he felt in his knees as he rolled forwards. His healing factor was already taking care of it. Gritting his teeth, Izuku then ducked under the robot's swinging arm, before lunging forward, his hand gripping onto the bot's face as he followed through with the momentum, knocking the robot over before he then slammed its metallic head into the concrete, his hardened hand shattering the robot's head against the asphalt road beneath him. With that done, Izuku stood up straight, a few small cuts on his face, caused by shards of metal from the destroyed robot, healing up rapidly in small wisps of steam. Not enough, not yet. Izuku muttered to himself, allowing the silvery blue sheen to leave his hands, his eye twitching a bit as he saw his red raw hands, even as his regeneration began to heal the burns. Another side effect of his quirk, unfortunately. When he used his hardening ability, he was effectively sealing the skin he covered, which in turn stopped the heat from naturally leaving those parts of his body. This, unfortunately, had the side effect of him hurting himself if he hardened parts of his body for prolonged periods of time, whilst also using the strength part of his quirk. Blowing on his injured hands, Izuku smiled grimly as he saw fresh, healthy skin form as the burns rapidly healed. Thank goodness for his healing factor. He didn't know what he would do without it. Pushing that thought aside for now, Izuku instead took off again, his muscles once again burning, even as he hardened both of his hands again and half of his forearms. He only had a minute or so left. He needed to push himself and go beyond. Within moments, he found himself at intersection, his teeth clenching into a grimace as he looked around and saw how the area was crawling with both robots and a desperate mass of students trying to finish them off. It was a chaotic melee. Surveying the area, Izuku saw Mina slipping and sliding here and there as she used her mobility and speed to deliberately steal kills from other prospective students. Apparently, honor and integrity meant nothing at this point in the exam. It was truly dog-eat-dog now. Glancing over, he also saw the green-haired girl from before using her vine-like hair to lash out, corral, bind, and then disable 3 robots at the same time. Her previously waist-length hair having extended to nearly 3 meters by this point, even as it shifted around autonomously, protecting the girl, fending off the applicants, and attacking the robots, all at the same time. That's 55. The green-haired girl muttered to herself, from not too far away, not even looking at any of the other applicants as she instead kept her mind on the task at hand and continued looking for more opponents. Haha, 46. Mina shouted gleefully as she also slid past Izuku, more acid spraying out of her hands as she rapidly began to encircle and dissolve a lone one-pointer. Shifting his head, Izuku noticed Tinya Ida rushing past him too, the taller teen's arms pumping in an exaggerated manner as he rushed forwards and then launched a brutal kick at the head of a two-pointer. With what looked like exhaust in his calf spitting out fire as he did so, adding extra power to the kick as he then proceeded to destroy his foe with a single blow. All around him, other applicants were doing exactly the same, getting in one another's way and stealing each other's kills as they all scrambled to get those last few points before the exam ended. Gritting his teeth, a look of absolute determination spread across Izuku's face, even as he lunged forward, hoping to get stuck in before all of the opponents were gone, and get stuck in he did, as within moments he had engaged a 3-pointers. His body twisting this way, and that as he avoided a spray of gunfire from the robot, even as he closed in on it. With the robot attempting to retreat as he did so, only for it to get stuck as one of its caterpillar tracks got stuck on a stick purple ball behind it. Seeing this, Izuku rushed forward, a silvery blue sheen covering the entirety of his right arm as he did so, even as he then clotheslined the struggling robots and cleaved it in two with a single roar of triumph. "Damn it, you stole my kill again," the same short boy as before shouted, his scalp noticeably bleeding as repeatedly grabbed and then threw the weird purple balls on his head at anything and everything that he could. His actions helping the other applicants around him out, probably more than they were helping him. This chaos lasted for another minute or so, with Izuku being able to only destroy a few more robots before he, like all the other applicants, was distracted, their attention drawn away from the few remaining robots and instead to the ground, which at that moment had begun to shake. "What's going on?" the girl with the vines for hair said, her features contorting in worry as she looked around nervously, searching for the source of the disturbance. "It's the 0-pointer," a lispy voice suddenly shouted fearfully, gaining Izuku's attention as he looked over and saw the short boy he had seen before, looking up in terror. Following the boy's gaze, Izuku soon discovered why he was so scared. After all, as he looked up, a nearby tower block suddenly exploded, even as a massive robot made its presence known. The 0-pointer robot standing closer 45 meters in height and probably 15 meters wide as it loomed over them, a towering mass of metal that cast all of the assembled students in shadow. "That's way too big," the small boy shouted, his eyes widening and beginning to water before, without another word, he turned and fled in terror. Not that he was the only student to run, as all around Izuku he could see the other students all fleeing. All of them either running in fear or running because there was literally no point in trying to fight the massive robot. After all, the 0-pointer was worth literally no points, as the name might suggest. Turning, Izuku made to do the same as the others and run away, only for him to stop mid-turn as he heard a sudden scream sound out, followed by a loud cry for help. Help. The unfamiliar voice called out, the girl's words reaching Izuku even as he, like so many others, turned to run away. The fear and exhaustion in the voice making him freeze mid-step before he turned around. As he did so, he immediately saw the person calling for help and the problem she had found herself in, even as dozens of others, including Ida, ran past him obliviously, all of them fleeing from the gargantuan robot. There was a short, curvy, unfamiliar brunette on the ground at the zero-pointer's feet. A look of fear and panic on her face as she desperately struggled to extricate herself from under some rubble that must have fallen on her when the zero-pointer made its presence known and destroyed that building. She was trapped, and she was scared. Izuku took all this in a second, even as he found his body reacting without him realizing. He was running again, but not away from the zero-pointer, but instead at it. His mind was a whirl as it moved at a mile a minute, his green eyes flicking up at the colossal, lumbering robot, even as it bared down on the girl, its robotic arm raised as if it were about to strike. He had to stop it. Without a word, he ran forward, his actions catching the attention of many of the other applicants that were running in the opposite direction, and of the girl herself, who, despite having been able to extract herself from the rubble, still looked to be unable to move due to her injuries. "Look out," the brunette called, reaching out to Izuku as he closed in on her. The giant zero-pointer behind her raising an arm as he did so, before moments later it threw a punch, but not at the girl, but at its new target, Izuku. In response, steam exploded off of Izuku's form, gusting out in all directions, even as moments later the robot's arm was caught. A large, tanned hand having caught the arm with ease, the massive fingers crushing metal, even as the rest of the giant's body emerged from the cloud of steam. The being now stood before the zero-pointer was close to 30 meters tall, his body completely bare, Kindle-like, and covered in steaming, chiseled muscles. Long, lank, greenish-black hair hung down from the giant being's head, framing his angular face, with long pointed, elf-like ears protruding from out of the locks. Even as his glowing, green eyes stared out, locking fiercely onto the zero-pointer. Standing up fully, Izuku ignored the shouts and screams of shock echoing all around him, as he instead stood to his full height. The sound of screeching and buckling metal sounding out as the zero-pointer tried to push forward, only to fail as the Titan pushed back. Grinning fiercely as he succeeded in pushing the zero-pointer back, Izuku opened his mouth and let loose another roar of challenge, the shockwave from his roar shattering the windows of nearby buildings, even as it sounded out for miles around. It was a roar that stuck shock into the hearts of all those that heard it for the first time, and either fear, anger, terror, or tension into the hearts of those that had heard it before. In the observation room, the silence in the room became incredibly tense as Midoriya took on his Titan form. Several of the teachers standing up, with some of them looking like they wanted to head down there just in case Midoriya went on a rampage. Most of the assembled teachers, however, remained calm, all of them watching the screens in front of them tensely, not saying a word as they focused on Midoriya, tense and ready to move if necessary, but still willing to give the teen a chance. As for All Might, the previously skeletal blonde had instinctively taken on his muscle form, beefing up from a lanky, skinny, ill-looking man to a 7-foot-tall muscle-bound giant, his hands instinctively gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that, with a groan of metal, they buckled and broke. "Nizu," All Might said tightly, his tense, glowing blue eyes locked on to the screen as he focused on Midoriya to the exclusion of all else. He didn't fear the boy, nor was he scared of fighting him. He had fought the rampaging Titan before and come out the victor, and he knew that, even in his weakened state, he would be able to do so again if necessary. No, he was not personally scared of Midoriya or his quirk or of fighting the teen. Instead, he was just incredibly nervous, bordering on scared, of having someone like him in UA and what the consequences of his presence might be. If the boy lost control again, and in a school too, the damage he could wreak could be catastrophic. The boy was too powerful. If he lost control, he could probably kill most of his class before any of the teachers had time to react, and there was probably nothing those students could do to defend themselves. or at least not if his transformation took them by surprise. Not only could this, if it came to pass, mean the deaths of dozens of students, it might also mean the end of UA, on top of which it could cause irreparable harm to hero society as whole. An entire generation of the country's best and brightest being wiped out in a single moment by one of their classmates. He couldn't even begin to imagine the true fallout from that. Leaning forward in his chair, All Might had to restrain his natural desire to leap down there and stop Midoriya. Intellectually, he knew what the doctors said about the teen, and that the government had vouched for his control. On top of which, Midoriya was not the first troubled child to come to UA. Both 13 and Endeavor had had similar incidents to Midoriya in their youth, maybe not as well-known or destructive, but they had both hurt people as children. Despite that, though, they had been given a chance, and had both become remarkable heroes, in spite of their difficult histories. But still, in spite of this, All Might had faced the Titan, and he had seen its fury and its power firsthand. The entire fiasco had left a mark on him. Even now, he could close his eyes and remember that night and everything that had happened in vivid, terrible detail. Izuku Midoriya was dangerous, and as such he remained leery of allowing him into UA. "It's fine," Nizu spoke out, the small mouse-like being's eyes locked on the monitor in front of him. "Just watch." Around the room, some of the teachers calmed down. A few, though, including All Might, however, remained tense, even as they saw Midoriya rise to his full and colossal height, his hand crushing the arm of the zero-pointer, even as he pushed it back and roared in fury. Elsewhere, Katsuki Bakugo froze, his eyes widening as he released a recently destroyed robot, allowing it to fall to the floor with a crash, as he instead stared off in the direction of that terribly familiar roar. It was impossible. Why would he be here, and why now? Far off in the distance, he could see smoke rising, even as the roar sounded out again, the bellow causing all those around Bakugo to also freeze up, most of them looking cautious or curiously off in the direction of the roar. A lot of them didn't seem to realize its significance. Instead, some just seemed to think it was part of the test, or that it was one of the other applicants in a different arena using their quirks. Bakugo knew differently, and as he mastered his fear, his red eyes narrowed, even as small explosions began to erupt in the palms of his hands, his entire body tense as he stared at the pillar of steam in the distance. Deku. There was one other in close proximity to Bakugo, who also recognized the sound of the roar for what it was. The boy's blue eyes narrowing, even as he grit his teeth in impotent rage. The blonde-haired teen, looking over in the direction of the sound like the others, fear warring with anger within him, even as he remembered his own experiences of that night. He might not have lost any family members, but he had lost his home and friends due to the events of that night. What the hell is Midoriya doing here? Nito Monoma hissed, his blue eyes flashing with anger, and his hands clenching into fists. How could a monster like him come to UA? Back with Izuku. It's the T-Titan. Minoru Mineta stuttered, the short teen with purple balls on his head, looking up in fear as he saw the colossal Titan looming over the area as it battled it out with the zero-pointer. He honestly didn't think he would ever see the Titan. The guy was infamous, even if the shock and fear that had been caused by the night of great loss had faded over the years. That boy, he was Izuku Midoriya. Ida Tinya muttered, staring up at the gigantic teen in shock, worrying his lip with his teeth as he remembered his interaction with the green-haired teen. That boy, the one he had gotten off to a bad start with, he was the Titan, Izuku Midoriya. Beautiful, Ibara Shiozaki muttered, the green-haired girl gazing up at the Titan's steam-wreathed form even as he clashed with the zero-pointer, battling it back through sheer brute strength. She had of course heard of the Titan and what he had done when he was just 5 years old. It was a terrible tragedy, but still he had been 5 and was not the first child to lose control of his quirk. He had just been one of the most public. If he was here, then that must mean he was now in control. That was her opinion on the matter at least, and an opinion that was shared by many others. All around the duo, dozens of other applicants had stopped fleeing and instead stood watching in awe, shock and fear as the Titan forced the zero-pointer back, before with another roar the giant being's other hand shot out, metal warping as he grabbed another part of the zero-pointer, after which, with another roar, he bodily lifted it off of the ground. Such power and raw strength. Incredible. How can someone be that strong? What is the Titan Dong here? Go on, Midoriya. Crush that tin can. The last voice belonged to Mina and sounded out loudest of all. Several other voices joining her as she shouted support, even as Midoriya lifted the zero-pointer clear off of the ground and away from the injured brunette at his feet. After which, with another roar, he ripped the zero-pointer clear in two, the sound of shattering, shrieking metal and explosions sounding out, even as he then threw both parts of the zero-pointer to either side of him. Fucking hell, he ripped it in two. The guy literally ripped that thing in two. Throwing his head back, Izuku let out one last roar whilst in his Titan form, before he vanished in another explosion of steam. A now human-sized Midoriya walking out of the thick cloud of steam, a conscious and pink-faced brunette in his arms, a few moments later. The girl in question, Ochako Uraraka, looking utterly shell-shocked as she tried to come to terms with everything that had happened. Her face and hands noticeably a little pink, and her tracksuit noticeably damp due to her proximity to the hot steam that had enshrouded Midoriya. Thank you. Ochako gasped out, not sure what else to say as Izuku continued to carry her towards the crowd of gawping students and away from the rubble of the fallen building and the wreckage of the destroyed zero-pointer, only for him to then gingerly put her down a few meters later. You're welcome, Izuku said softly, forcing a smile onto his face as he saw all the people looking at him. No one saying anything as everyone just seemed to stare at him in shock. Right up until Mina broke that silence. Holy shit, that was so badass, Mina shouted, dancing forwards and enthusiastically throwing her arm around Izuku's shoulders. Her words unleashing an avalanche of voices as some people shouted and cheered for him, whilst others asked whether he was really trying to get into UA, with still others only just clocking onto who he was or staying back nervously, noticeably putting quite a bit of space between him and them. Before Izuku could reply to any of the questions and accusation being thrown at him, he was interrupted by the sound of Present Mic's voice once again ringing out around the arena. And that's IT time's up, Present Mic shouted, his voice sounding out through the arena and causing all action to come to a halt as the students either celebrated or commiserated depending on how well they think they did. Well, that was fun. Izuku finally spoke up, as he looked over at Mina, sharing a smile with the pink-skinned girl as she released him, trying to ignore all the other people that were still looking at him as he did so. How did you do in the end? 47 points in the end. Not quite 60, but I hope it's enough to pass. Mina replied with a shrug as she looked away from Izuku, and instead looked around the area, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the shattered buildings, cratered streets, and mounds of broken robots. So much for not destroying the place. Izuku chuckled weakly as he heard that, looking around at the surrounding carnage as he did so. It appeared when people with quirks went all out, there was a lot of collateral damage. Luckily, though, Izuku was only responsible for some of this destruction. Yeah, glad I'm not the one cleaning it up. A week later. It had been a week since the UA entrance exam, and Izuku was beginning to get nervous. Initially, when he had first left the UA campus and headed back to his small two-room apartment a couple of miles away, he had been both quite confident in his chances and excited to find out his results. He knew he had done well on the written portion of the test. His literal years of revising and preparation for that one test had set him in good stead for that, on top of which he knew he had done admirably in the practical test. When he compared his scores to that which the other contestants had gotten, even his friend Mina, he knew he had excelled. He had acquired more than enough villain points to qualify, on top of which, with his academic scores, he was almost certain he would be accepted into UA, and that his years of dedication and determination would pay off. A tense week of waiting later, though, with nothing to do save for go out and shop for the essentials like clothing and food, and read and watch television, his inner confidence had slowly begun to erode. Already his mind was plagued with worries. What if they penalized him for taking his Titan form? They had not specifically set any limits on using Quirk, but maybe his history would count against him. Maybe the teachers would think that by him taking that form, Even though it was just a test, he was somehow showing that he was not in control. That, or maybe they had only allowed him to take the test so they could make out that he was being given the same opportunity as everyone else, when in fact they never had any intention of letting someone like him come to UA and had dismissed him out of hand. That this was all just a sham, a pretense at fairness and inclusion? Thoughts like those had regularly started to plague him over the last week. Even as the days slowly passed, boredom set in, and still no word came from Yue, either about him passing or about him failing. What would he do if he was rejected? He could go to Shiketsu High, another prestigious hero academy in Japan, though one that did not have quite the same international fame as Yue. Trying to go there was a possibility, but what if they rejected him for the same reason that Yue might? What could he do then? He wanted to save people, to balance his karmic ledger and redeem himself for the mistakes he had made that night all those years ago when he had been 5 years old and had lost control of his quirk. He wanted to be a hero so he could do some good in the world, and so he could save and protect people. That had been his dream for most of his life, the one goal that had gotten him through the heartache of losing his mother and the realization of what he had done. That one goal, that one ambition, had driven him forward and had lent him the strength he needed to not only gain control of his quirk, but to also push himself beyond the limits. What would he do if that goal was no longer possible? He could always join the military. Even with the advent of quirks and the creation of a superhuman society and the rise of the pro-hero profession, there was still a need for emergency services, firefighters, police, doctor, and of course the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Every country had an army, or were protected by another country that had an army. Though notably, the different countries' armed forces were drastically smaller than they had been in the times before quirks. After all, in a superhuman society, it was not quantity that mattered, it was quality, power, and skill. From what Dr. Nakamura had told him, Japan had an army 100,000 strong, all of whom had rigorous training with their quirks and licenses to use them on the battlefield or in public, when sanctioned to do so by the government. Effectively, they were state-controlled heroes who were always ready and waiting to be deployed, either to bring an end to internal issues or fight against external threats. For Izuku, such a profession would be a good opportunity to serve the people, even if he would prefer to go the pro-hero route. Pro-heroes, after all, had more freedom and could go on patrol and help where they needed. They did not have to await orders. Instead, they could just act as and when necessary. Already he had been approached, using Dr. Nakamura as a proxy, about signing up. Apparently a quirk as powerful and potentially destructive as his was highly sought after, and more than a few generals and officers had spoken with Dr. Nakamura about the possibility of recruiting Izuku, training him up, and then unleashing him on the country's enemies. Of course, Izuku wasn't the only one the army had shown interest in. The teens that were sent to Asphodel, those with immensely powerful quirks, or uncontrollable quirks, or no morals when it came to using their quirks, they all ended up doing one of 4 things after their time in Asphodel came to an end. They either became pro-heroes, like he wanted to be. They tried to fit back into society and forget their pasts. They went back out into society, continued as they had been doing, relapsed, and then ended up being thrown into prison or being sent to Tartarus, the maximum security adult prison, for the rest of their lives. Or they were recruited into the army and became living weapons, just like the test of the state pro-heroes. Over the years, Izuku had considered all of these options. He didn't want to try and rejoin society as a civilian. He would help no one doing that, and would probably end up living a very unfulfilling life and die full of regrets if he did so. As for being a villain and getting sent to Tartarus, well, that was the last place he would ever want to go. The place was synonymous with hell on earth. The army, though, that had been a potentially viable option that he had genuinely considered when he was younger. Or at least until Dr. Nakamura had said his piece and expressed his belief in Izuku becoming more than just a living weapon, but instead a hero. Becoming a pro-hero, again, that was his goal, and it had been for years now. It was all he had ever wanted, the chance to save and protect the innocent. That was what he ideally wanted for himself. But if he wasn't given a chance, if the academy rejected him for the things he did 10 years ago, when he was 5, then he would have to find a new way forward. He could join the army. Or he could try his luck at another, less prestigious, hero academy. Honestly, he didn't know. With that thought, Izuku let out a sigh, even as he sank backwards into his sofa. With Izuku currently being in his small, pokey apartment, sitting on his sofa/fold-out bed, the green-haired teen not paying attention to the messy state of the kitchen area in one corner of the room, or to anything else as he instead just sat on his sofa watching some TV, absent-mindedly doing some curls on his right arm with a dumbbell as he did so. His attention mainly on the program on TV, the Hero Channel, a highly popular TV channel that was run by a dedicated team of people who spent their time filming the actions of heroes, rating their pros and cons, and basically giving a commentary on their actions. It was a popular channel, one that was full of action and excitement, and which had been around for decades. No, it had been going for even longer than that. The channel's first iteration had been back during the dawn of superheroes. Back when the pro heroes of the time operated by a points-based system with their saves and captures earning the heroes' points, which in turn were accumulated at the end of each season and used to rank the heroes of the time against one another and to bring in viewers and revenue to the private companies that sponsored said heroes. Of course, back then the profession was not a public service as it was now. Instead, each of the heroes were funded by private companies, all of whom made money by advertising products using the heroes they sponsored, either by having the heroes act in adverts, or adding advertisement logos to their hero costumes, or creating films and television series based off of them. Luckily, that practice had died out decades ago, and nowadays all heroes were, technically speaking, public servants, and although they could make money on the side, they all received a generous stipend from the government to live on and to use in their heroic endeavors. A stipend which could be increased by additional work that the heroes or their agencies could take on themselves, such as by modeling or going on talk shows. Shaking his head as he realized that his mind had begun to wander, Izuku focused back on the television. Originally, he had started watching the TV to distract himself from his dour thoughts over his future. Or at least that was until he saw which pro hero they were doing a special on today, at which point he had decided to tune in, not just to distract himself, but because he was also genuinely interested. After all, today's special was on Mount Lady, a relatively new, up-and-coming hero who had a gigantification quirk. A quirk which was very similar, if a bit weaker, than his own Titan quirk, with Mount Lady only being able to grow to 20 meters tall, and with her not having either a hardening ability or healing factor to go with her increased size. Still, despite this, the young woman in question had become an incredibly popular and successful heroine, despite her having just made her debut, with Mount Lady having not succeeded in doing any high-profile takedowns yet. Which, now Izuku thought about it, made her rise in fame and popularity surprising, especially as quirks like hers had a bit of a stigma about them nowadays, with many still initially treading cautiously around those with gigantification quirks, or size-altering quirks, due to both the collateral damage that came with using such quirks in a city landscape and the reputational damage that he, Izuku, had caused 10 years ago. In spite of this, though, Mount Lady had succeeded in not only graduating UA High, but in also becoming a famous pro hero. A pro hero that was known to cause a lot of collateral damage, of course, but a hero all the same. Focusing on the screen as a picture of the costumed heroine in question popped up, Izuku narrowed his eyes slightly. From glance, he began to get the rather cynical suspicion that her sudden rise in popularity was most likely due, at least in some part, to the fact that she was an absolutely stunning, curvaceous blonde, one that stoked the libido of most men. Still, her appearance aside, that didn't take away from the fact that she was still doing a sterling job for a newbie, and was noticeably getting better as time went on, and causing less damage, and getting more results the more experience she gained, which was something the current panel were espousing as they debated the pro hero's merits. Honestly, just listening in on the way the panel on the TV talked about her gave him hope for the future. If one person can break through the stigma associated with gigantification quirks, then, with enough graft and hard work, Izuku could do the same and prove to the world that he was better than he had been and was in complete control of himself. Of course, before he could do that, he needed to go to a hero academy first. Izuku let out another slight sigh at that thought, the same miserable thoughts as before assailing him once again. A sudden rattle from his door, however, quickly distracted Izuku from the television set and his muddled thoughts. He recognized the sound. It was the sound of something being pushed through his letterbox, and considering the only people that knew his address were the staff at Asphodel, the local police, the government, and UA, well, he was pretty sure he knew what it was. Without another thought, Izuku dropped his dumbbell on his sofa before he leapt up and crossed his small apartment in seconds, and then grabbed the letter that was now lying on the floor just in front of his door. A nervous smile slowly spread across his face as he turned the envelope over and saw the U stamp it had on the front. Staring down at the envelope for a few moments, noticing as he did that it was heavier than it should have been, Izuku waited barely a few seconds before he ripped the thing open, his heart beating like a drum as he prepared to find out whether or not he had made it into UA. Opening the envelope, a frown quickly crossed his face as he saw that instead of a letter like he was expecting, there was instead a small metal disc inside. Picking the disc up curiously, Izuku ended up dropping it quite quickly, letting out a sudden yelp as he saw the little disc begin to light up, making a whirring noise as it did so. "I am here," as a projection. A sudden loud and familiar voice rang out, gaining Izuku's attention as he looked down and recognized the voice and catchphrase as belonging to the world's #1 hero, All Might. Almost at once, Izuku tensed slightly, an uncomfortable tension settling in his gut as he looked down at the small projection of said hero. The man in question was a hulking blonde, with glowing blue eyes, black scara, and a large, 7-foot-tall, heavily muscled body. Even as a hologram, the man cut an impressive figure, and a familiar one too. Back in his youth, Izuku had once idolized All Might. He had looked up to the hero and been in awe of him. Then that night had happened, and he had seen footage of his rampage and how eventually he had fought and been annihilated by the, at the time, recently anointed #1 hero, All Might. Were it not for his regeneration, Izuku knew he would have been killed that night. It was pretty hard to look at a person in the same light you once had when you had also seen video footage of that same person punching you so hard that half of your head exploded in a shower of blood, bone, brain matter, and gore. It had been vivid and visceral, and thinking back on it now, Izuku knew he had been too young to see it at the time, even though he had insisted on it. The memory of it lingered in his mind even now. Still, the fact remained, All Might made him uncomfortable. The strength the #1 hero possessed, and the look of anger and ferocity on his face when he had engaged him, it had ingrained itself into Izuku's psyche. All Might was not the kind of person he would ever want to cross again. If the man had been able to destroy him 10 years ago and end his rampage of destruction in just 5 mighty blows, then he didn't want to see what an All Might with 10 years more experience and skill would do to him, even with him growing bigger and getting more control. Even for someone with regeneration, like Izuku, the image of the massive blonde man caving in your skull with a single punch was pretty impactful. It wasn't something that you could just forget. All Might? Izuku questioned cautiously after a few moments, his hands clenching into fists as he looked down at the miniature image of the world's #1. "Yes, young Izuku Midoriya. It is I, UE's newest teacher, All Might." The hologram continued speaking, his tone as loud as before, though holding a certain edge to it that Izuku noticed was absent when he was interviewed by the press. "Can you hear me? Or is this a recording?" Izuku asked, poking the metal disc curiously, his green eyes not leaving All Might's grinning form, even as he digested the fact that All Might, the greatest hero in the world, would be teaching at UA. "Well, I am sure you have been wondering how you did on your entrance exam into UA." The hologram continued, All Might's smile not wavering for a second as he gave no indication that he had heard Izuku at all. "I guess not then," Izuku muttered to himself, relaxing slightly as he scooped the disc up and placed it on his coffee table, leaning forward in his seat as he did so, his attention solely fixed on the image of All Might. "Yes, well, I can confirm that you passed the written exam with a spectacular result of 97%. Not quite the highest, I'm afraid, but admirable when compared to the average score of 73%. All Might continue. his tone not changing for an instant. Izuku nodded at that, a wave of pleasure flowing through him at the realization that he had scored so well, with him even going so far as to score 24 points above the average. Though admittedly, he was a bit surprised that someone had done better than his own very high score. That surprise, though, only lasted for a moment, before he remembered that this was UA, the school that attracted the best of the best, and even then only allowed the best of those to attend. Some teen, or maybe even more than one, with an intelligence-based quirk had probably scored 100 in the written test. As for the practical test, well, you did even better there. Not only did you get a full 100% by gaining the 60 points you needed, you went above and beyond by scoring a total of 68 villain points from destroying robots, with a further 40 rescue points. All Might continued, his smile becoming a bit more genuine now, and real enthusiasm leaking into his voice as he continued speaking. This means you scored 108 points in total, more than enough points to not only pass your entrance exams, but to get the highest score in the practical test out of all of our candidates. Well done. What? Izuku asked, his mind going blank as he heard that. He had gotten the highest score in the practical, the highest out of the thousands that took the test. It was almost unbelievable. He knew he had done well, but he didn't think he had done that well. And also, what the hell were rescue points? And what did he do to deserve 40 of them? He assumed, by the name, that they were something to do with rescuing people during the test. But as far as he knew, the only person he had rescued was that girl at the end. And even then, he didn't think that doing something as simple as that, even for the right reasons, deserved a reward. Well done, young Midoriya, you passed. All Might finished, his grin becoming slightly tighter now. Before, without another sound, the hologram shut off, leaving Izuku in stunned silence. I passed, Izuku muttered, his heart beginning to beat faster even as a smile crept across his face. I did it. I got into UA. A few weeks later, looking around in awe, Izuku couldn't help but grin as he walked through the bustling hallways of UA, weaving through the dozens of other students that milling in the corridors, all of them wearing the same gray school uniform. Continuing on, his backpack safely on his back and a wide, eager smile on his face, he felt more excited than he ever had before. This was his first day of high school, and also the first time in 10 years that he would be associating with normal kids his own age. It was both exciting and, admittedly, a bit nerve-wracking too. He wanted to make a good first impression. He would be with these people for next 3 years after all. It was already bad enough that he would be starting school with his history weighing him down. The last thing he wanted to do was add to that by making a bad first impression on the rest of his classmates on the first day, and then have to live with that. Classroom 1A, Classroom 1A. Izuku muttered to himself, looking at each of the large 20-foot-tall doorways he passed, each of which lead off from the main corridor and into a classroom. The doorways looked excessive from a first glance, but considering the kinds of mutation quirks that there were out there, they had probably been built that way to accommodate everyone, just in case an exceptionally tall or wide person came to school here. Classroom 1A. Where the hell is 1A? Izuku muttered to himself as he weaved his way through the crowds of students and entered a new corridor. This place is like a labyrinth. Almost as soon as he said this, Izuku suddenly stopped, his eyes lighting up as he finally found the door to his classroom. He was here. This was it. Forcing a smile onto his face and squaring his shoulders, Izuku confidently opened the door, aware as he did that of the thousands of candidates that applied to the UA Hero course, only 36 kids passed the exam to get in, plus 4 other students who got into the academy based on recommendations. With these 40 students then being sorted into 2 classes, with 20 kids in classes 1A and 1B respectively. This meant that behind this door were the literal best of the best, those who had proven themselves worthy enough, skilled enough, and dedicated enough to have been chosen to become the next generation of pro heroes. A number in which Izuku now counted himself in. After all, he too had passed the exams entirely on his own merit, just like all of them. Their pasts and origins might all be different, but right here and right now, they were all starting on the same footing. Opening the door and striding confidently into the room, A slight smile spread across Izuku's face as he immediately noticed that the two girls he had spoken to back during the entrance exam were here. Both Toru Hagakure, still completely invisible, save for her school uniform, and Mina Ishido, as cheerful and pink as ever were in the room. Both of them chatting amiably to one another at one of the desks, even as a dozen or so other students milled around, some of them making idle chit-chat, whilst others were already sat at their desks, patiently waiting for the form room period to start. Smiling at this, Izuku allowed the door to close behind him even as he looking around, his mind whirling as he quickly found himself recognizing more than a few of the other people in the room with him. For one, there was that short-haired girl with the extended earlobes, who, upon hearing someone enter, looked over at the door, a curious expression crossing her previously bored face as she gave Izuku an evaluating and speculative look for a moment, before she then turned back to speak with her companions. One of whom was a girl with large eyes, black hair, and distinctly amphibian-like traits, whilst the other he recognized as the curvy brunette who he had saved during the entrance exam. As well as those two, there was another girl standing with them, with this one having a lithe form and shoulder-length straight hair. Only this girl's hair was dark black, and her eyes were an intense blue. Noticeably, though, this girl also wore a distinctly emotionless expression on her face as she listened, more than talked, as group of four girls conversed. Giving the earlobe girl a tight smile as she glanced back at him, and receiving a nod in return, Izuku then assessed the rest of the room, noticing as he did a large, heavy-set kid with long brown hair which he wore in a ponytail and noticeably big lips. With this guy talking to a very tall teen who had 3 pairs of webbed arms and no noticeable mouth, and another teen, who Izuku recognized also, that had a black, bird-like head on a skinny human body. Shifting his attention from them, Izuku then noticed another odd-looking teen, with this one having half of his hair white and the other half red. The teen in question having a bored look on his face as he grudgingly spoke with another classmate, this one being an exceptionally attractive girl with long black hair that was tied up in a spiky ponytail of sorts, and a sublime body. Glancing away when he noticed the cold eyes of the kid with half red and half white hair on him, the heterochromatic eyes narrowing even as his lips became a thin line, Izuku instead turned to look at the rest of his class. As he did this, Izuku quickly noticed an effeminate-looking blonde kid on the other side of the room, who was currently chatting with another familiar face. It was the attractive girl from the entrance exam, the one who had green vines as hair. Only instead of being as long and wild as it had in the exam, her vine-like hair was instead waist-length, and had noticeably been woven into a thick plait that hung down her back to her waist. Behind the girl, Izuku's brow furrowed as he saw someone else he recognized, the short kid with purple balls for hair, who at that moment was sitting at the desk behind the green-haired girl, his mouth practically watering as he looked lecherously between the many girls in the class. With the short boy in question letting out a perverted giggle as he scanned the room and eyed up some of his classmates like they were pieces of meat. Was he one of these perverts that Dr. Nakamura had told him about? Izuku mused as he looked at the boy for a moment, before he shook his head and prepared to make his presence known to the rest of the class, and head over to say hi to the only people in the room he knew, Toru and Mina. As he did this, he continued to survey the other teens in the class, like the one with short blonde hair and large muscular tail, or the other one with dark hair, blocky elbows, and an odd smile on his face. Both of those two were pretty odd-looking, far more so that the last 2 members of the class, the 2 spiky-haired boys in the corner, one of whom had blonde hair whilst the other had bright red hair, both of whom, Izuku noticed, were talking amiably over in the corner of the room with another familiar face, the bespectacled and abrasive teen, Tenya Ida. "Hey, Midoriya!" Mina shouted, a large smile on her face as she looked up and saw the spiky green-haired teen at the door. The pink-skinned girl waving enthusiastically at Izuku as she did so, Hagakure's arm sleeve waving along with her, as the invisible girl turned to look at him too. "Yeah, you made it in too." Toru chirped happily, her invisible body giddily rocking backwards and forwards on her seat as she spoke. As the Mina called out his name, Izuku noticed the reactions of the rest of the class as they turned to look at the newcomer, him. Some, Like the blonde kid with a tail, the muscly teen with big lips, the effeminate blonde, the spiky red-haired guy, the spiky blonde-haired guy, the frog-like girl, and a couple of others just looked over at him curiously. Several of them smiling and waving, clearly not recognizing him at all, even as a couple of others frowned in confusion. Their expression telling him that they recognized the name, but couldn't quite place it. Others, meanwhile, like the half-and-half guy, the tall dark-haired girl with the spiky ponytail, the girl with shoulder-length black hair and blue eyes, the girl with extendable earlobes, and the guy with no visible mouth, but multiple arms, all paused and stared at him in shock, surprise, or caution. These ones, Izuku guessed, were the ones who both recognized the name and connected the dots, and thus knew who he was. Notably, and thankfully, none of them looked particularly scared or angry. Instead, they just looked curious. Though the half-and-half boy, he noticed, had a slight frown on his face as he looked at Izuku, almost as if he didn't know what to think of him. Then finally there were those, like Tenya Ida, the kid with purple balls for hair, the curvy brunette he had saved, and the girl with green vines for hair, all of whom clearly not only recognized him from the exam, but had also seen him assume his Titan form too. Oddly though, all four of these teens' reactions were different. Tenya Ida seemed to tense up for a moment, his brow furrowing and his mouth opening, almost as if he were about to say something, only for his mouth to snap shut moments later as he instead gave Izuku a stiff nod and kept a neutral expression on his face as he then resolutely looked away from him and back to the two spiky-haired teens. The short kid with purple balls on his head, meanwhile, just looked like he was about to piss himself. There was both recognition and fear in his eyes as he gazed at Izuku, his lip quivering as he sank lower into his seat, almost like he was attempting to hide from his gaze. Those two were reactions he had expected, dismissal and fear. The other two, meanwhile, they surprised him. The short brunette, she actually smiled when she saw him and waved, her face going a little pink as she sent him a thankful look. The short, curvy girl looking for a moment like she was going to approach him, before a few seconds later she thought better of it and instead gave him an awkward wave instead. The green-haired girl, however, just looked at him in fascination, what she had previously been completely forgotten, as she just gazed at Izuku in a way he could never remember be looked at before. It was a mixture of respect, awe, interest, and dare he saw it, a slight amount of reverence. For Izuku, the alienness of this look was a little discomforting. Tearing his eyes away from the green-haired girl and looking around, Izuku wasn't sure what he should do next or how he should act with the attention of the rest of his class for the next 3 years entirely upon him. Luckily, though, he didn't have to, as instead, Mina came to his aid. "Come on, get over here, Midoriya. I want to hear about how well you did in the exam. I was just telling Toru about how you went full Titan and picked up one of those 0-pointers and ripped it in half with your bare hands." Mina called out enthusiastically, the horned girl gleefully unaware of the looks and expressions of the rest of her classmates as she instead just hopped off of her seat and bounced over to him. Almost at once the other students began muttering to one another about what Mina had just blurted out. Some of them, like the spiky red-haired kid, loudly calling Izuku manly as hell, whilst others, those in the know, turned and told those who didn't recognize who Izuku was about him, and probably about how he was capable of literally picking up a 0-pointer and ripping it in two with his bare hands. Their expression noticeably going from confused to shocked, the nervous, and then to befuddled as they shot Izuku odd looks. Ignoring the assortment of looks being sent his way, Izuku, with the tension now well and truly broken by Mina, instead walked over to the pink-haired girl and the now standing Hagakure, a slight smile on his face. "Hey Ishido, Hagakure. I'm glad you two got in too," Izuku replied, a grin spreading across his face as he phased out the ongoing muttering all around him, and instead met up with the duo. He was just glad he would be assured of having at least 2 friends in his class. It was better than he could have hoped for. "I know. I mean, can you believe it? We made it into UA." Mina shouted enthusiastically as Izuku approached, lunging forwards as she did so, and throwing her arms around the taller teen. Toru, although equally excited, not doing the same as she instead just high-fived Izuku without him noticing. "Yeah, I really can't believe it. Even now, When I am already here, I still can't quite process it. We passed. Yeah, it's amazing. Izuku replied with a grin of his own, glad he wasn't the only one that was incredibly excited for what was to come. All those years of hard work, and they had culminated in him getting in him passing his entrance exam and being allowed to come to UA. Izuku clenched his hand into a fist at that thought. This was it, he was here. He had overcome the first hurdle in his journey to be hero. All that was left was for him to graduate. Yes, this was it. He would use all the opportunities UA gave him and the same determination that had gotten him here and become the best hero that he could be. We're here at UA. I can't wait to get started. Izuku continued with a bright grin, one that Mina, and he assumed, Hagakure, mirrored. It was as he said this, that, almost coincidentally, their homeroom teacher spoke up and decided to announce and introduce himself. The man's dull voice cutting through the chatter in the classroom, causing many of the talking students to quiet down as they all eventually clocked onto the fact that they were no longer alone. If you're here to have fun, do me a favor and leave now. At once everyone stopped talking, all of them looking around the room for the speaker, with the most observant of their number quickly finding the source of the voice. The source being a sickly, pale, and tired-looking man, whose only visible feature at the moment was his unkempt, dour-looking face, with the rest of him being covered up by a big, puffy yellow sleeping bag. This is the hero course. Get your act together. The man continued speaking bluntly, his voice low, bored and disinterested as he gazed around the classroom from where he was slumped on the floor. Who the hell is this guy? Mina whispered to him and Toru quietly, all three of them eyeing the guy curiously as he crawled out of his sleeping bag and walked to stand in front of the rest of the class. Our homeroom teacher, I'm guessing. Izuku muttered back, a vaguely disappointed expression on his face as he saw how unimpressive the man was. He was expecting more from their homeroom teacher, especially since all of the teachers at UA were supposed to be pro-heroes. This guy, though, Izuku, didn't recognize him at all. Be quiet, the man said abruptly, his attention fixed on Izuku and Mina as he gave them a seemingly bored look. His voice not rising at all, but still holding a certain edge to it as he turned away from them and then looked around at the rest of the class. It took you too long to quiet down. Time is limited, so next time I expect you to be silent and in your seats before class starts. As for who I am, the teacher continued, sending Mina a dull look as he did so. I'm your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa. It's a pleasure meeting you, I'm sure. Around the room, a number of the assembled students shifted. Shota Aizawa was not giving them a good first impression, especially since the man was supposed to be their form room teacher. Good, now put these on and go to the training grounds. Your first test begins now. Aizawa continued speaking as he gazed around, locking eyes with everyone in the room at least once, before he reached into his sleeping bag and pulled out a bunch of blue and white track uniforms. Our first test. Already, Izuku thought, his eyes widening as the class began to grab the track uniforms and leave the room. This is more like it. With Izuku. Currently, Izuku, along with the rest of Class 1A, was stood waiting patiently at the side of one of UA's large training grounds, all of them wearing the Academy's standard blue and white track uniforms. At present, the group of 20 were all, for the most part, standing around awkwardly, one or two of them occasionally making attempts at small talk, or at introducing themselves to their classmates for the next 3 years. The class had only fully assembled for the first time around 15 minutes ago, and not many of them had had the chance yet to properly introduce themselves to one another, the kind of things the students were usually expected to do on their first day at school. Instead, their form room teacher, Shoyuta Aizawa, had thrown them all track uniforms, told them to get dressed, and then told them to head out onto one of the school's sports fields once they were ready. Standing in front of the assembled students, still wearing his dark clothing, and a mess of bandages around his neck, like scarf, Aizawa continued to explain just what this test would consist of, his expression dour, and his tone never changing from his now customary bored monotone. A Quirk assessment test. Tenya Ida, the bossy and abrasive teen Izuku had met at the exams, spoke up in surprise, the bespectacled teen's brow furrowing as he pushed his glasses further up his nose with one of his hands, his mouth set in a thin, tight line. His tone filled with both confusion and consternation as he looked to Aizawa for an explanation. Aizawa sent the tall, broad-shouldered teen a bored look before he gave a curt nod in response. The dull look not leaving his face as he then looked away from Ida and over at the rest of the class, after which he finally replied in a bored tone. Yes, now get ready. Wait. The short, curvy girl with shoulder-length brown hair spoke up, her hazel eyes wide as she waved one of her hands in air to try and get Aizawa's attention. What about the introduction ceremony that we are supposed to be going to? Or the tour of the school? Or the briefing on what we'll be covering in hero class this year? Izuku glanced sideways at the girl. It seemed he wasn't the only one to have read the information pack complete with the itinerary for the first day that UA had sent out before the start of the school year. Amongst the rest of the group, several other students nodded, frowned, or muttered as they too began to question what they were all doing out here in track uniforms, when they should by all rights be either on a tour of the school or at the school's opening ceremony. Enough, Uraraka. I'll say this now, so I don't have to repeat it. If all of you actually want to be heroes, then it is best that you learn quickly that you won't have time for things like that, Aizawa replied, barely even glancing at the girl whose question he was addressing, or at any of the other students either. Instead, he seemed to be looking through them, and at the rest of the school's campus behind them. U.A is so successful partly because of the great freedom it allows on campus. That freedom extends to the teachers, allowing them freedom to teach their students in the manner that they deem fit. Izuku, who was currently within the crowd of students, frowned as he heard Aizawa's words and processed just what he was actually saying. Such a system was based on a lot of trust, one which could very easily be abused and could very easily lead to inconsistent teaching throughout the different classes. A bad teacher, or an unmotivated one, could cripple an entire class's learning. Personally, it made him uncomfortable that his entire career at school would be based, to some extent, on the kind of homeroom teacher he got, with this being something that could affect the type and quality of the hero he could one day become. Considering who he had apparently been landed with, his discomfort only increased as he eyed the pale, dark-haired teacher cautiously. He didn't make it into UA just to fail, because he was lumbered with a useless teacher that didn't even seem to want to be teaching them. Yes, after all the effort and all the backbreaking work he had put in just so he could make it to UA and then graduate and become a pro hero, he would be less than pleased if all of that were to be for nothing, all because he'd been lumbered with a piss-poor teacher from the offset. You all remember the exercises you had to do in middle school, right? Aizawa continued speaking, apparently oblivious to his students' thoughts, as he instead got on with what he wanted to say. The physical tests where you weren't allowed to use your quirks? This country, like many others in the world, still hasn't gotten around to standardizing those sort of things. As far as I'm concerned, it's completely illogical. Izuku cocked his head to the side as he heard this. Having not been to a proper school since he was 5 years old, he had no experience of the standardized tests Aizawa was talking about. Back at Asphodel, he had always been encouraged, when in a safe and controlled environment, to go all out with his quirk. After all, control could only be gained through experience. That said, though, Aizawa's statement about the current system being illogical, that was something he could agree with. If people, students, were being held back from reaching their full potential by society's obsession with everyone being on an equal footing, then that was indeed pretty stupid. That was something that worked and was acceptable back in the day, before quirks. And even then, people had had different levels of intelligence and fitness due to either genetics or the way they were raised. Those days, however, were long gone. In a world where 80% of people had some kind of superpower, limiting students so that they didn't pull ahead of others due to the innate abilities that they had been born with was in fact damaging the development and growth of people and society as a whole. It was the kind of thing that would cause stagnation and decline. If you limit everyone so that they never surpass the lowest common denominator, then you would be crippling the development of entire classes, no entire generations of future heroes. The world was not a fair place, and not everyone was born equal, or at least not in terms of what quirks they were born with. Now, Aizawa began as he pulled out an Android tablet from his pocket, with him then absent-mindedly tapping the touch screen to turn it on, even as he surveyed the class, no doubt looking for a candidate/test subject that he could use to make his point. His dull eyes noticeably locking onto him. Izuku. Let's just get to it. You, Izuku Midoriya, the so-called Titan, you scored the highest in the entrance exam. So tell me, how far can you throw a softball? Izuku frowned as he heard this, ignoring the muttering from the rest of the group as they all eyed him. Most curiously, though again the short kid with purple balls on his head backed away terrified, whilst the kid with red and white hair just scowled at him. Honestly though, the reactions were tamer than he had expected. I didn't go to a normal school, sir, Izuku finally said after a few moments, his brow furrowing as he watched Aizawa carefully. Unless this man was stupid, then he should have already known this. Whenever I did things like this, I was allowed to use my quirk. I was supervised, of course, but I wasn't limited. I didn't ask about your school. I asked about how far you can throw a softball. Aizawa replied bluntly, his tone still bored and his gaze flat. Well, when I'm in my base form, but still using my quirk, I was able to throw it 932 meters. Izuku replied carefully, watching Aizawa carefully as he did so. He didn't know what the man was up to. Was this some kind of trap? Was he being singled out for a reason? All around him, the other students started whispering, many of them audibly muttering how he was lucky to have been allowed such free rein to use his quirk. In his opinion, their words came from a place of ignorance. He didn't feel lucky to have grown up like he had. Not at all. Give it another go, Aizawa said abruptly, tossing a softball to Izuku as he did so, his expression not changing as he then gestured for him to stand in a nearby circle that had been set into the ground, one that was specifically made for events like shot put and discus, without using your quirk. Frowning as he heard the last thing Aizawa said, Izuku threw the ball up and down in his hand, testing its weight as he walked into the circle, after which he pulled his arm back, not drawing on his quirk like he usually did, as he instead focused on technique. Taking a deep breathing, Izuku made his throw, the ball hurtling forward with quite some speed as it looped up, over, and then down, before bouncing a couple of times, rolling, and then coming to a stop. 78 meters, not bad. Aizawa nodded, his expression not changing as he looked out at the rest of the students, all of whom were muttering. Listening in on what they were saying, Izuku couldn't help but roll his eyes. They all seemed surprised by the score and the fact that it was so low, even with him not using his quirk. It was like they thought he possessed monstrous strength even when not using his quirk. It was almost like they expected him to be inhuman, as opposed to what he was, an ordinary kid with an extraordinary quirk. Right, now do it again. Use your quirk this time, though. As long as you don't leave the circle, it doesn't matter what you do. Don't hold back, though, Aizawa called out, his voice sounding out over the rest of the class's muttering, garnering their silence as they all watched on, their gazes all fixed on Izuku as the teacher threw him another ball. Nodding his head, Izuku looked down at the circle he was standing in. It was 5 foot in diameter. If he took on his Titan form, then he would be unable to stay within the bounds of the circle. Gritting his teeth and ignoring all of the attention he was receiving, Izuku drew on his quirk, not fully assuming his Titan form, but accessing some of its strength as he pulled his arm back, using the same technique as before, and then hurled the ball. This time as he threw it, the ball did not so much as fly out of his hand as it did explode, a slight shockwave blasting outwards from Izuku at the force of the throw, even as the ball, shot up, arced through the air, and then landed much farther than it had done previously. Once again the class started muttering, many of them talking about how strong the throw was, a far cry than it was when he had used his quirk. Others meanwhile were questioning why he hadn't gone full Titan when he threw the ball. Not even blinking at the reactions or at the force of the throw, Aizawa instead just watched as the gauge on his tablet continued to rise as it tracked the distance the softball went before it finally hit the ground again in the distance. Before you can think about training to become heroes, you first need to know your uppermost limit. That's how we form the basis of your hero training. With that said, Aizawa turned the tablet around and showed the class the final score, with the screen showing that Izuku had just thrown the ball just over 965 meters. Are you serious? Kirishima, the kid with spiky red hair, shouted out, a surprised look on his face as he saw how much further Izuku could throw the ball when using his quirk to enhance his abilities. He had no doubt heard him tell them how far he could throw it before, but to actually witness it, to see irrefutable proof, that was a whole other thing. That's nuts. Izuku grinned as he heard this, turning around as he saw several of his classmates. Mina, Toru, Kirishima, the spiky blonde-haired kid, the girl with vines for hair, and a number of others clapping and jeering him on, with a number of others nodding their appreciation or muttering excitedly to one another, clearly eager for when they would be taking their turns. There were no overt displays of fear or caution. Though that was not to say that all the reactions were entirely positive. The red and white-haired boy had gained a competitive glint in his heterochromatic eyes and was sending him a speculative look. The teen with big lips and a ponytail was cracking his knuckles, a smirk on his face as he sent Izuku a challenging look. Ida, meanwhile, had grit his teeth and was muttering to himself about how he would approach the task. It looked like he would have a lot of competition. But really, that wasn't surprising. The hero class of UA was made up of the best of the best. All of these teens had put in the work and had the determination to make it here. Izuku very much doubted that any of them would settle for second best, not if, like Aizawa said, they wanted to be heroes. This looks like it's going to be fun. We can use our quirks all we like, Mina said loudly, throwing an arm around Toru gleefully, the pink-skinned girl clearly hyped for the challenge to come. Aizawa, however, shifted slightly as he heard her words, his attention turning to the vibrant, pink-skinned girl. It looks fun, huh? Mina froze as she heard the tone of the man's voice, a slightly different tone than before. All around her, the other students also looked a bit taken aback by the sudden display of what could almost be called aggression. Aizawa didn't look happy. His expression might not have changed, but his tone definitely had, as too had the look in his eyes. It was no longer bored. Instead, it was a look of annoyance. Were you planning on having a good time during these 3 years here? If that's how you feel, then let's change things up. The student who ranks last in the 8 tests I'll be giving you today will be judged as having 0 potential and will be immediately expelled from the hero course. Aizawa continued, a slightly creep smile spreading across the man's face as he saw several of the students recoil in shock and horror at his statement. Izuku, though, scowled as he heard this. He did not like the way this was going. Everyone here had just passed through a rigorous entrance exam. They had all surely proven that they at least deserved to be here, that they had potential. It was unfair for them to be tested before they had had any further training to hone their abilities, especially since it was only the first day. He wasn't worried for himself, of course. His quirk was naturally geared towards physical power and fitness. It was practically made for the tests Aizawa would be throwing at him. No, he wasn't worried about himself. He was concerned about others. Not everyone's quirk was suited to purely physical exercises. Some quirks focused on heightened intelligence and analytical abilities. Others, meanwhile, were better suited to rescue work than fighting and physical test, or to tracking and searching. If Aizawa's tests were going to be like Izuku expected, then he was concerned. The man would be weeding out all those who didn't fit his personal criteria for what made a hero. This in turn could be damaging for society in general. The diversity of heroes and the diversity of what they specialized in was important. There were very few pro heroes out there that excelled in every kind of hero work. It was this kind of bullshit that Izuku hadn't liked when Aizawa had explained about the freedom the teachers had when working here at UA. He knew the school would be difficult and that they would weed the lackluster, the ill-suited, the inept from the group, but this isn't what he had in mind, not on the first day anyway. As he scowled at this, Izuku quickly noticed that some of the other students were having slightly more extreme reactions than others. The little kid with purple balls on his head had begun to shake his eyes, now quite weepy. The girl with vines for hair was frowning slightly. She seemed as displeased at this as Izuku and Ida. While he looked like he wasn't sure whether to wholeheartedly support Aizawa's statement or condemn it. Glancing sideways, Izuku, who by this point had fallen in line with the rest of the group, was able to see that Mina, at least, although looking a bit shaken, still retained a semblance of her old confidence as she gritted her teeth and clenched her hands into fists. Aizawa grinned as he saw the mixture of reactions, from excited to nervous to angry, the older man not at all perturbed as he saw the expressions on some of the students' faces. his grin sharpening even further as he saw the terrified expression on Mineta's face, a big contrast to the confidence several other students were showing. In this school, the teachers can also use their freedom to expel students as we choose. Welcome to U.A's Hero Course, kids. Wait a minute. Toru spoke up, catching the rest of the class's attention as she voiced Izuku and several others' concerns. This is just our first day? You can't just expel people without giving them any training. That's way too unreasonable. Indeed, it is injustice, reckless, and illogical. The girl with vines for hair added, her expression angelic and her voice soft, melodic, and beautiful, despite the accusations in her words as she frowned at Aizawa. That's the life of a hero, and the sooner you learn that, Hagakure and Shiozaki, the better. Aizawa replied as he glanced at the invisible girl and then over at the green-haired girl, his smile widening and his tone now rich with dark amusement. Natural disasters, horrendous accidents, rampaging villains. These are the kind of things that can and will happen when you least expect it. It's the job of a hero to stand strong through all that insanity and calamity and bring order. If you were thinking that you could just have a good time playing around out here every day, then let me burst that little bubble for you right now. From here on out, for the next 3 years, U.A is going to throw more hardships at you than you could count. The entire class looked taken aback at that. Not even Izuku knew what to think. The man had a point, no matter how much of an arsehole he came across. And he really did come across as a massive arsehole. It was painful, but he did have a point. A hero had to be able to react to the unexpected, fight through adversity, and always endeavor and fight come out on top, no matter the odds arrayed against them. For if he or she did not, then innocence would suffer. Heroes should always strive for excellence, for in a life and death situation, even a single mistake could spell calamity. You want to be heroes, don't you? Well, overcoming these hardships and coming out stronger and better than before, that is the only way you will become one. Now step up and show me what you've got, Aizawa said challengingly, his smile still creepy as his dark eyes scanned the assembled students, momentarily lingering on Izuku's scowling face as he did so. Sometime later. What followed next after Aizawa's uplifting little speech were, as he had stated, a series of physical tests. With these tests including the softball throw test, the 50-meter dash, grip strength, standing long jump, continuous side jumps for a minute, the long-distance run and toe touches, and for the most part the entire class did well, with most people scoring very highly on at least one of the tests. For example, the pretty girl with shoulder-length brown hair, Ochako Uraraka, turned out to have a quirk that allowed her some semblance of control over gravity. And through the use of her quirk, she managed to somehow score an infinity on the ball-throwing test, easily getting the best score in the class. In fact, most of the students in the class had at least one of the events that they excelled in or several that they did relatively well in. With some of those who had more versatile quirks, like Izuku, Ibara Shizuki, Momo Yaoyorozu, Fumikage Tokoyami, and Shoto Todoroki all excelling in the majority of the events. Unfortunately, though, some of the students in Class 1A had quirks that weren't as versatile, with some like Mina Ishido, Masahiro Ojiro, the guy with the tail, and Kyokujiro, the girl with the extended earlobes, and Mizo Shoji, the kid with 6 arms, only doing well in one of 2 of the events. Suffice to say, as the morning continued and the students progressed through the 8 different tests, things started to become tenser and tenser as some students noticeably pulled away from the main body of the students in terms of their scores, whilst others began to trail behind. With those that weren't particularly suited to the tests like Toru Hagakure, Minru Mineta, and Yuga Aoyama, noticeably get nervous that they themselves might not make the cut as the tests continued. As for Izuku, well, he wasn't anxious at all, but that was more to do with the sheer versatility of his quirk in terms of these kinds of tests, and the experience he already had using it. For the most part, he had scored well on all of his tests. In the 50-yard dash, he had managed to score second in the class, his enhanced physical abilities allowing him to easily outscore all but Tinya Ida, whose quirk it appeared allowed him to run incredibly fast thanks in part to the weird engine-like devices on his calves. In the grip strength test, Izuku had once again scored very well, as like with the 50-yard dash, he had used his quirk, which in turn allowed him to use around 10% of the strength he had in his Titan form, even whilst in his base form. This had been more than enough for him to score at the top of the class, ahead of even Mizo Shoji, who with his 3 pairs of arms was able to rank second in the hand grip. For the rest of the events, Izuku had also scored highly in all of them, not quite grabbing the top spot in every single test though. The side-to-side jumps were not really his forte, but the rest he had excelled in, his enhanced strength and stamina allowing him to get within the top 5 for the standing long jump, long distance run, and toe touches. As the last of the events came to an end, and Izuku jogged past the finishing line for the long distance run, his face and body a bit sweaty, but his breathing still even, he looked around briefly, noting as he did so that Ida had finished before him, as had the big-lipped boy, Rikido Sato. Though admittedly the tall, bulky teen looked dead on his feet as he collapsed to the floor tiredly, several empty packets of what looked like sugar falling out of his hands as he fought to catch his breath. "Ha, I finally beat you." Midoriya, Sato grunted out, looking up at Izuku, even as several of their other classmates crossed the line one after the other. Momo Yaoyorozu was amusingly enough using a motorized scooter that she had formed with her Quirk creation. "So you did," Izuku acknowledged, a slight smile on his face as he saw the taller teen's exhaustion. He hadn't even realized that the other kid had been directly competing against him. "Well done." Sato grinned tiredly at that, and then gave him a thumbs up. Smiling, Izuku looked away and instead waited as the last of the class filtered past the finishing line, those that were capable of doing so using their quirks to help them, whilst the others that didn't have quirks suited to the task just did the best that they could. "Right," Aizawa said as the last of the students finished the run, the final test. "That's it. For most of you the test is now over." "For most of us?" Momo asked, a frown on her face as she caught on to what he had just said. "Yes, nearly all of you gave everything you could and did your absolute best in the tests. You gave it your all, so most of you have got at least that going for you," Aizawa drawled, as he looked over at Momo and gave her a flat look. Izuku stiffened as he heard this. A sudden tension had descended on the class. They could all sense trouble. Their teacher was about to single someone out for not trying hard enough, and everyone was no doubt worried about who that person would be. Personally, he felt a sudden sinking feeling in his stomach as Aizawa's eye locked onto him. "Midoriya," Aizawa said after a moment. Almost unconsciously, all the students around him moved back a few steps, making a small circle form around him as he felt the eyes of both his teacher and the rest of the class rest on him. "Sir," he replied cautiously, ignoring the others and instead locking gazes with Aizawa. "You didn't perform to your full potential," Aizawa said after a moment. "Not once during the test did you go 100%. Instead, you only used 10% of your total." The class around him started audibly muttering to one another as they heard that. Izuku, though, ignored them. "Did I fail?" "No," Aizawa replied after a moment. "You actually came in first out of the whole class, closely followed by Yaoyorozu and Shiozaki." Again, yet more muttering from the class, with there being some consternation now about him performing best out of all of them, in spite of him only using 10% of his power. Honestly, a part of him could understand their frustration. "I don't see the problem then, sir," Izuku replied. "This test was about pushing yourself to the limits and seeing what you can do. You never pushed yourself to the limits," Aizawa said, his voice verging on cold as he looked down at Izuku. "I want to know why." "Pragmatism and necessity," Izuku replied after a moment of thought. "For the toe-touching and side-to-side jumping, an increase in height, size, or strength would not have aided me in the slightest. For the long jump, I could clear the designated range without using the full extent of my quirk. It was not necessary to assume a large form to complete the task, on top of which the collateral damage from leaping in that form would have been excessive and not worth me raising my position 2 places in order to get the top positive. Taking on my Titan form in the grip test too would have been pointless unless you had a griper tester big enough to properly fit in my hand. As for the 50-meter dash and the long-distance run, although I could have won if I used my quirk to its fullest extent, I was confident enough about placing in the top 2 or 3, so I did not think it necessary or practical. Nor did I think it was safe for me to be running around in a 30-meter-tall form whilst my fellow classmates were around me and potentially underfoot. All around the students started to nod. No doubt they were imagining what it would have been like if they were racing against a 30-meter-tall titan that could turn them into mincemeat if it accidentally stood on them. As for the ball throw, taking my titan form would have forced me out of the circle and thus invalidated my throw. Izuku tagged on at the end, just so that he covered all bases. I see, Aizawa said after a moment, and for a second, as he did so, Izuku spotted a genuine smile on the man's face, even if it was a tiny smile, barely more than a slight curving of his lips. So you used common sense and prudence, and came to a conclusion on how you should use your abilities. Yes, Izuku nodded. Okay, Aizawa said, before he took out his tablet again. Now the rest of the students have finished, and the scores have been tabulated. I see no reason why you shouldn't be able to do the softball throw again, just to see what you're capable of. Izuku cocked an eyebrow as he heard this. Surely Aizawa knew about his backstory, and therefore knew of the tests and training he had undergone. Dr. Nakamura had included it all in the report he had sent to UA prior to his admission. It contained all the pertinent details about his quirk, his capabilities, his education, his training, and his mental state. Not everything, of course. Izuku was allowed some privacy, but all the things that were necessary for UA to know ahead of time. With that in mind, Izuku couldn't help but ponder what Aizawa was up to. Why did the man seem so set on him taking his Titan form? So, does that mean that this won't count towards my final score? Izuku asked, ignoring the excited muttering of his classmates behind him and Mineta's terrified wittering. Correct, the scores have already been finalized. This is so both you, and to a lesser extent I, can see what you're capable of, Aizawa said mildly. Izuku nodded at that. All right then, fine. With that said, Aizawa threw him the ball, even as he stepped out of the crowd of students. Good luck, Midoriya, Toru shouted behind him. Yeah, go show that ball what you're made of, Mina added. This is going to be so freaking manly, Kirishima shouted. Show everyone what you've got, Ibara's soft voice called out too, adding to the support and encouragement most of the class, or at least 2/3 of them, were sending his way. Izuku nodded as he heard all of this, a slight grin coming to his face as he continued to walk away from the group and over to the circle, Aizawa noticeably keeping the rest of the students back as he instead kept his gaze fixed resolutely on him. Taking a deep breath, Izuku threw the ball up in the air even as he drew on his quirk and assumed his Titan form. Almost instantly steam erupted from his body, the blast of hot air knocking those around him backwards, even as he felt himself being hurled up into the air, burning hot muscle forming around him, along with a gigantic skeleton, all of it developing around him as he opened his eyes and saw through his Titan form's eyes and felt the cold wind blowing about his Titan form's naked skin, the steam still blowing off of his now 30-meter-tall body as he reached out and caught the now, comparatively, minute ball in his now massive hands. With the rest of the class. For his classmates below, they could only look up in awe, shock, and in some cases nervousness as they witnessed, most of them for the first time, the Titan. The full power of the team that had destroyed a city district at the age of 5 and had only been stopped due to All Might intervening personally. For some, the sight of the colossal Titan, its chiseled muscles gleaming in the mid-morning sun and its eyes glowing an intense, phosphoric green, even as steam continued to issue forth from its form, was humbling. Some in the class, those like Momo and Todoroki, they had always excelled. They had gotten into the school on recommendations and had both thought themselves to be within the upper echelons of their current generation in terms of their quirks, their intelligence, and their skills. For them, witnessing the raw, visceral power the Titan exuded, it was enough to make them look at themselves and how they compared to such a devastatingly powerful being. For others, those that had only heard of the Titan, they could only look up in awe at the being in front of them. It was an infamous sight, a sight that had once, and probably still did in some case, struck terror into the hearts of all who had looked upon it. There were even some amongst the class whose reactions went beyond awe, with some of the class bordering on near reverence at the sight before them. Ibara Shizuki, Fumikage Tokoimi and Yui Kodai, although acting very differently outwardly, shared a similar fascination as they saw the Titanic being in front of them catch the now minuscule, in comparison, soft ball in one of its large hands. The action showing a startling level of control and coordination. Of course, not all those in the class reacted entirely positively. Some, like Tsuyu, the frog-like girl, Hantasiro, the dark-haired kid with bulky arms, and Mizo Shoji, felt a little bit nervous about the sheer size of Izuku's Titan form and the intimidating presence it gave off. Though that was understandable, the Titan was gigantic. There was also, of course, Mineta, who as the sight of the Titan let out a slight shriek and went to hide behind the grinning Kaminari. The blonde, lightning user in question responding to the sight in his own, distinct way. Hey, he doesn't have a dick. Suffice to say, it was Kaminari's well-chosen words that broke the tension as several people in the class laughed, the sound sounding wrong in the tense atmosphere, even as a couple others looked for themselves and noticed the very same thing. Izuku's Titan form was like an action man. It had no genitals. Seriously, that's the first thing that comes to your mind, idiot. Kyoko groaned, rubbing her forehead as several of the other students started laughing. Go ahead, Midoriya. Aizawa, the only person present to have not reacted, called up, his eyes narrowing as he saw the Titan turn to look at him, its glowing green eyes boring into him, before with a curt nod it turned, pulled its massive arm back, and then threw the ball. The force of his throw releasing another shockwave. Only this time it was far above their heads, and so had less of an impact on the watching spectators. That said, as Izuku threw, Aizawa's lank dark hair rose up into the air, and his dark irises suddenly glowed red as he tried to using his Quirk erasure quirk on Midoriya. As he did so, however, he couldn't help but grit his teeth in annoyance as he found himself unable to cancel the quirk. He wasn't sure why either. He was looking directly at Midoriya, but nothing was happening. It was almost like the body he was looking at wasn't Midoriya's. It was perplexing to say the least. All right, that's it, Aizawa called, breaking off eye contact from Midoriya now as he instead squinted and tried to see how far the ball had just gone. What followed next was another bigger explosion of steam, this wave causing more than a few of the class to stagger backwards as the hot, humid air washed over them, the steam blinding their vision for a moment. With Izuku. Moments after Izuku had reverted to his base form, however, the steam dispersed and revealed Midoriya, still in his blue and white track uniform and looking none the worse for wear as he approached the class, a cheerfully smile on his face as he saw most of his classmates cheering for him. Hey Midoriya, that was awesome, Mina shouted as Izuku approached, a large grin on her face as she saw how far he had just thrown the ball. Thanks, Mina, Izuku replied easily as he walked over to his pink-skinned friend, the rest of his class crowding around him as he did so. Some of them asking about his quirk, and one or two, mainly Kaminari and surprisingly, Toru, teasing him over his genitalless Titan form, which was something that he deliberately didn't rise to. It was impressive, man, but like super scary too. Hantasiro grinned, awkwardly patting him on the shoulder as he did so. It was spectacular. The quirk you wield is truly something else. Momo nodded, a strained smile on her face. I apologize for not taking you more seriously. Air, Izuku replied, sending the dark-haired girl an odd look as he did so. How was he supposed to respond to that? Enough talking, Aizawa cut in, thankfully making Izuku's last thought redundant as he walked over to the class, his shoulders slouched and looking the same as ever, his dark eyes locking curiously on Izuku as he approached, only for him to then raise the tablet in his hand and show it to the waiting class. 1,327 meters. It was higher than his previous score, but not quite double. Several members of the class started muttering in surprise at this realization. It's because of the weight and size of the ball. If the ball was bigger and heavier, he would have thrown it even further, but since it was light, the wind resistance, friction, and several other factors weighed against it. Momo spoke up swiftly, explaining to those that hadn't already realized the reason for the low score. Correct, Aizawa said lightly. Your control impressed me, Midoriya. I will admit I was skeptical after reading the reports, but as the common saying goes, seeing is believing. Thanks. Izuku replied cautiously. Was this the reason he had had him take his Titan form? An additional test just for him, so that he could see whether or not he was in control. It was also important for your classmates to witness your other form. Better it be here, in a relatively controlled setting, than in the middle of battle training or something like that. Aizawa continued, his eyes slipping past Izuku for a moment, something he noticed as he followed his gaze, only for him, and likely one or two of the others, to see. All Might, clad in a yellow suit, leaning against the side of a building 100 or so meters away, watching. The number one hero in question standing a little straighter as he noticed he was being watched, before with a smile he raised his arm, waved it once, and then disappeared around the corner. Seeing this, Izuku narrowed his eyes minutely. So that was what he had meant when he said that this was a controlled setting. He meant All Might was around, just in case Izuku did lose control and needed to be stopped. Now, with the last of the tests done, let's get down to the results. Aizawa pressed on, seemingly oblivious to Izuku's thoughts as he instead led them all over to a large display board at the side of the field, his fingers dancing across the tablet in his hands as he board began to present the scores. First, Izuku Midoriya. Second, Momo Yaoyorozu. Third, Ibara Shiozaki. Fourth, Shota Todoroki. Fifth, Fumikage Tokoyami. Sixth, Tenya Ida. Seventh, Mizo Shoji. Eighth, Masahiro Ogio. Ninth, Ejiro Kirishima. 10th, Mina Ishido. 11th, Yui Kodai. 12th, Rikido Sato. 13th, Ochako Uraraka. 14th, Siyu Ajui. 15th, Hantashiro. 16th, Yuga Aoyama. 17th, Denki Kaminari. 18th, Kyokujiro. 19th, Toru Hagakure. 20th, Minoru Mineta. And no, Minoru muttered, his eyes watering as he looked up at the scoreboard, and then at the straight-faced Aizawa, his lip quivering as all around him his classmates sent him looks of pity. Please, and Mr. Aizawa. Sorry, kid, but you're out. Aizawa replied, his tone bored and his expression uncaring, even as several students, those who doubted Aizawa's threat, gasped. Momo most noticeably amongst them as she raised her hand to her mouth and looked at Aizawa in shock. No, Mineta cried, looking beseechingly around at all the other students. It's the first day, you can't expel me. Yes, it is the first day of the hero course, and your last, Aizawa replied dryly, his words cutting Mineta to his core. I will put in the paperwork for your transfer today. You'll be allowed to stay on in general education, and will, if you prove yourself, be allowed the chance to return. For now, though, you're out, and your spot will be left open to the students from the other courses to fight over. Mineta started crying at that. The rest of you head back to class. Mineta, you come with me. Aizawa forged on relentlessly. Hearing the boys' cries, Izuku looked away and followed the others as the now somber class headed back to the school. A part of him had hoped that Aizawa had been lying, that it had been a trick to get them to perform at their best. Turns out, Aizawa didn't lie. With the cries of Mineta ringing in their ears, Izuku, no doubt like the rest of the class, couldn't help but accept the grim reality of just how competitive, grueling, and ruthless the next few years at UA were going to be. The next day, entering his classroom at the start of his second day at UA, the first thing that Izuku noticed as he stepped into the room was that almost the entirety of his class was already present. A lot of them already sitting on or behind their desks, a loud rumble of chatter dominating the room. This being in spite of the fact that the form period wasn't due to start for another 20 or so minutes. Closing the door quietly behind him, Izuku quickly found himself being waved over to where Toru and Mino were sat, both of them looking up from the conversation that they were currently having with the green-haired Ibara Shiozaki and the spiky red-haired Kirishima, the moment he entered the room and grinning at him. Or at least he assumed that was what Toru was doing, going off the invisible girl's body language. Or should that be clothes language? After all, the only thing he could see of her was her school uniform. Still, the two girls, his first real friends his own age, happily waved him over the moment he entered the room, the other two with them sending him smiles too, even as he started heading in their direction. Giving the group a half wave and a slight smile as he approached, Izuku also quickly found himself being greeted by the other members of his class, some of them shouting out to him or waving, whilst others, like Todoroki and Shoji, just gave him curt nods and then went back to the conversation they were having before his arrival. It was an odd feeling for him, Izuku noted, as he smiled at Momo as he passed, for him to be so easily accepted, especially considering how nervous he had been when he first came to this school. Hey Midoriya. Mina grinned, a bright smile spreading across her pretty, pink face, even as she joyfully slapped him on the back as he took his seat. You sure took your time getting here, didn't you? I'm still early. Izuku shrugged, not sure what else to say as he smiled at Toru, and then turned to the other two that he had met, but not yet spoken to properly, noticing as he did so that the green-haired girl, Shiozaki, seemed to be watching him, a hint of fascination in her gaze. Hey, I'm Izuku Midoriya. It was a pretty pointless thing to say. After all, they all already knew one another's names, if not because they had already at least introduced themselves to the others, then because all the names of the class had been displayed on the scoreboard at the Quirk assessment test the other day. I know, I'm Ibra Shiozaki. The green-eyed girl, Shiozaki, replied, a gentle smile on her pale, beautiful face. I don't think we had the chance to talk the other day. Yeah, it was a pretty hectic day. Izuku nodded, shifting in his seat somewhat uncomfortably as Kirishima gave him a greeting next, the loud redhead slapping him on the back as he did so, and extolling the virtues of manliness to him.